This is Charles Manson's house in San Francisco's Haight Ashbury district. In 1967, he lived here with some of his most famous quote-unquote family members, including Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel. Susan and Patricia, of course, were both involved in the Sharon Tate murders in 1969. Other notable Manson members who lived with Charles at this house included his girlfriend Mary Brunner and Squeaky Fromme. Manson rented this house in 1967, which already raises questions because how did he have the money to rent it? In 1967, Manson was fresh out of jail with nothing to his name, so how did he afford to rent this place? There are a lot of peculiar things about Manson's time in San Francisco, including his connection with the infamous Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Many people believe this clinic was actually a front for the CIA, specifically for the MKUltra mind control program. Interestingly, this clinic shut down after Tom O'Neill's book Chaos was released in 2019. That book exposed the clinic's ties with the CIA. Manson's house was just a few minutes walking distance from the clinic. In other words, almost immediately after being released from prison in 1967, Charles Manson just happened to live right around the corner from an alleged MKUltra location. The former Manson house is located at 636 Cole Street, and the former clinic is located at 558 Clayton Street. Literally a few minutes walking distance. Quick note, all these locations have been documented extensively in various Manson-related publications. I'm not revealing any private information here. Now, in the book Manson in His Own Words, Charles Manson reflected on what it was like living in San Francisco. Quote, "I was out there on the floor innovating to the beat of the Grateful Dead. I was wild and I was loose. The acid, LSD, the music, and the loss of inhibitions opened up a new world for me." End quote. There's two things Manson said in this quote which stuck out to me: acid and the Grateful Dead. In previous videos, I've touched on how Manson used LSD to brainwash his followers. I'll be expanding on that momentarily, but first, let's talk about the Grateful Dead. This is the famous Grateful Dead house in Haight Ashbury, San Francisco. The Grateful Dead lived here through parts of 1966 to 1968. They wrote some of their most iconic songs in this house. It's become a very well-known tourist location in Haight Ashbury. Deadheads, fans of the Grateful Dead from all over the world, come to visit it every year. The Grateful Dead house is also just a few minutes walking distance from both Charles Manson's house and the infamous Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Haight Ashbury is a district, an area of San Francisco. The center of the Haight Ashbury district is literally the intersection of Haight Street and Ashbury Street, which is right behind me here. In 1967, this area became the epicenter of the hippie movement. The summer of '67 in particular became known as the quote-unquote Summer of Love. Now, Haight Ashbury is not a very big place. People from across the area would often mingle with each other, especially people in the hippie counterculture scene, which both the Grateful Dead and Charles Manson were part of. It's entirely within the realm of possibility that the Dead and Manson may have had some contact with each other during the Summer of Love. According to the Los Angeles Times, the first known instance of Charles Manson trying LSD was actually at a Grateful Dead concert in San Francisco in 1967. Now, of course, that doesn't prove in any way that Manson and the Dead knew each other. Even if they did, that also wouldn't automatically suggest anything malevolent was going on. People in Haight Ashbury knew each other. It was a community that mixed a lot, especially the hippies. That's why it's very plausible Manson and the Dead may have had some contact with each other. I have been looking to see if there was any sort of noteworthy connection between the Dead and Manson, but thus far nothing really has come up. If you know of any connection between Manson and the Dead, let me know in the comments below. Manson, of course, had many major music industry contacts, though that wouldn't happen till a year later in 1968 in Los Angeles. The summer of '68 in Los Angeles was when Manson became close friends with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Manson's friendship with Dennis Wilson is arguably his most famous relationship with someone in the music industry, but it certainly wasn't his only relationship. Manson, for instance, also had a relationship with Neil Young. Neil Young even gave Charles Manson a motorcycle as a gift and tried to help Manson get signed to a record deal. I'll go over some of that information later in this video. For now though, let's go back to Manson's history in Haight Ashbury in 1967. A very important Charles Manson-related spot in San Francisco was the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. This is where things start to get darker. As mentioned earlier, many believe this clinic was actually a front for the CIA's MKUltra mind control program. Furthermore, a lot of people are convinced Manson in particular was an MKUltra asset. Manson famously used LSD, acid, to brainwash his followers. Brainwashing people with LSD is something the MKUltra program studied and experimented with extensively. With regards to Manson and this clinic, there are three people to keep in mind in particular: Dr. Jolly West, Roger Smith, Manson's parole officer, and Dr. David Smith, founder of the clinic. Roger and David Smith have no family relation. I'm going to be exploring the significance of all three of these people to the story of Charles Manson, starting first with Roger, Manson's parole officer. On March 21, 1967, Manson was released from prison in Los Angeles. Almost immediately, Charles Manson violated his parole. He was supposed to stay in Los Angeles, yet within days, Manson was in Berkeley, California, about 6 hours north of Los Angeles, right across the water from San Francisco. The following is from Chaos by Tom O'Neill. Quote, "Within days of his release, Manson violated his parole. Unless he had explicit permission, he was supposed to stay in Los Angeles under penalty of automatic repatriation to prison. But practically immediately, he headed to Berkeley, California. Years earlier, Manson had had his parole revoked just for failing to report to his supervisor. But now, for some reason, the police bureaucracy of an entirely different city welcomed him with open arms. When Manson called up the San Francisco Federal Parole Office to announce himself, they simply filed some routine paperwork transferring him to the supervision of Roger Smith, an officer and a student at UC Berkeley's School of Criminology. As a doctoral student, Roger Smith studied the link between drug use and violent behavior in gang members. By 1967, Roger was regarded as an expert on gangs, collective behavior, violence, and drugs. Interestingly, Charles Manson, Roger's one and only parolee, would go on to control the collective behavior of a gang through violence and drugs. It was Roger Smith's idea to send Charles Manson to live at Haight Ashbury. Roger hoped that Manson could quote-unquote soak up some of the vibes of peace and love in Haight Ashbury. Maybe it would help neutralize some of Manson's hostile tendencies. And so Manson moved from Berkeley to Haight Ashbury, crashing wherever he could and never paying rent. End quote. Never paying rent. Again, as I mentioned off the top of this video, this was the house Charles Manson rented in Haight Ashbury. Yet, Manson didn't have any money. As you just heard from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, Manson never paid rent in Haight Ashbury. So how was Manson able to rent this house in Haight Ashbury? That's a legitimate question. There's a lot of very strange questions about Manson's time in San Francisco which have yet to be answered. The following is also from Chaos. Quote, "Once Manson landed in Haight Ashbury, he dropped acid on a daily basis. Roger Smith wrote that Manson seemed to, quote-unquote, accept the world after LSD. Seemingly overnight, Manson transformed himself into an archetypal hippie. Although only in his early 30s, he presented himself as a father figure, attracting young, down-and-out men and women. According to one of my sources, no one knew Manson better than Roger Smith. It would therefore be surprising if Roger Smith didn't know that Manson was breaking the law. A lot. Mr. Manson has made excellent progress," Roger wrote in one of several reports he made to the head parole office in Washington, D.C. "Mr. Manson appears to be in better shape personally than he has been in a long time." Roger wrote those words on July 31, 1967. At the time, however, Manson was sitting in a jail cell. A few days earlier in Ukiah, California, about 2 hours north of San Francisco, Manson was convicted of interfering with a police officer in the line of duty, which is a felony. Manson was trying to prevent the arrest of Ruth Ann Moore, one of his newly recruited underage girls. Though the charge was reduced to a misdemeanor, Manson was given a 30-day suspended sentence and 3 years probation. Instead of being sent back to prison, however, Manson, who'd been out of prison for only 4 months at that point, was back on the streets again in a few days. End quote. It's stuff like this which has convinced a lot of people that Manson was in fact some sort of a government asset. Because how is it that Manson could violate his parole by going to San Francisco, yet never be sent back to Los Angeles? Then, how did he end up renting a house in Haight Ashbury with no money, a house which just happens to be walking distance from a medical clinic which many believe was a CIA front? How is it that Manson was quickly allowed back on the streets of Haight Ashbury after getting arrested again in July of '67? Again, none of this definitively proves that Manson was a CIA asset, but it certainly raises a lot of questions. Now, I'll be exploring Roger Smith's connection to the clinic shortly, but first I want to take a look at Dr. Jolly West, one of the other key figures from the clinic. Dr. Jolly West was an influential, active participant of the CIA's MKUltra mind control program. This is not a conspiracy. This is extensively well documented. The following is a brief summary of Dr. Jolly West's history with MKUltra by journalist Howard Fisher. Quote, Some of West's research on mind control was done as part of the CIA's Project MKUltra from 1953 to 73. Illegal human experimentation was done to develop procedures and drugs to weaken people and force confessions through psychological torture and brainwashing. These experiments were conducted at over 80 institutions, which include military bases, universities, and hospitals. Special brothels were even established where customers were secretly dosed with psychoactive substances. The drugs tested included LSD and amphetamines. Sometimes the drugs were combined with electroconvulsive shock treatments, hypnosis, and more. Several people died or were permanently damaged. Now, among his notable work, Dr. West performed psychiatric examinations on Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby, of course, being the killer of Lee Harvey Oswald, who had assassinated President John F. Kennedy. End quote. Bottom line, Dr. Jolly West was an expert in mind control. Notably, he also experimented and researched how LSD could be used to brainwash people. As mentioned earlier, Jolly West was part of the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic during the period in which Manson lived right around the corner from the clinic. Manson and his followers would frequently visit this clinic. Again, none of this definitively proves Manson was part of MKUltra or that Jolly West had direct ties with Manson, but it does raise a lot of obvious questions. With specific regards to LSD and brainwashing, I'm going to show you clips from two of Manson's murderers, Susan Atkins, who took part in the Sharon Tate murders, and Leslie Van Houten, who took part in the LaBianca murders. Both of these Manson girls talk about how LSD can radically change you. This first clip is of Susan Atkins from 1978.
I used to think that you came down off an acid trip after 12 hours. That's not true. When you take acid, you think you're coming back to where you started from. Originally, you don't. And every time you drop acid, you get a little bit further away from reality. And I took so much acid that I just was what I would term spaced. Your concepts of right and wrong. So you step out beyond those bounds, and when you step out beyond those bounds, the imagination begins to take over. And the imagination can be a very deceitful thing. I would take a thesis, writing a book on what LSD can do to the mind.
The following clip is from Leslie Van Houten from 1977.
When I first met him, he was kind of upset that I was there because I had been with a friend of his, and he was frightened that my being or staying at the ranch would come between him and this other fellow. But on the whole, he was a very dominant person. Sometimes he was nice and sometimes he wasn't. More than anything else, though, he was the only one that any of us ever felt knew that he knew what he was doing. And when we would take the acid, we would take it with a lot of us together, and then he would speak to us and move with his gestures, and more or less, he never told us, you know, that was one of his things. He always made sure to never tell us anything. He would suggest things.
Permanently influence someone's thought patterns by suggesting things to them. That is exactly how MKUltra experimented with LSD. Coincidentally, it's also how Manson conducted LSD brainwashing. Again, Dr. Jolly West was part of MKUltra, and he was right around the corner from Manson at the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. The founder of the clinic was this guy, David Smith. In the mid-60s, before founding the clinic, David was working at the San Francisco General Hospital as the chief of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Screening Unit. According to Tom O'Neill, David once said the following: "I was injecting white rats with LSD in the lab, and then I'd walk home past Haight Ashbury, where I'd see kids who were high on the same substance." This simple observation is quite symbolic. Some people believe the LSD-using hippies of Haight Ashbury were essentially lab rats being tested on to see what kind of effects LSD would have on them. This is the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic today, by the way. It's this building right in the middle. Sorta. It's the back portion of this building behind the Tibetan sign. As mentioned off the top of this video, the clinic was shut down shortly after the release of Tom O'Neill's book in 2019. In that book, Tom went into great detail about the CIA connections with the clinic. I'm going to read to you those details from Tom's book momentarily. Before I do, however, I want to familiarize everyone with a few words. In this passage, Tom refers a lot to the drug speed. To be clear, speed is not the same as a speed ball. A speed ball usually refers to a mixture of cocaine and heroin. though a speedball sometimes can be a mixture of other substances as well. In any case, heroin is known as a downer drug. It slows down the body, whereas cocaine is known as an upper drug. It's a stimulant. Speed is also an upper. Speed is a type of amphetamine drug. Amphetamines, generally speaking, are prescription drugs. Speed, however, although it's an amphetamine, is illegal. Speed can make a user feel happy, but it can also cause unwanted effects such as aggression. In terms of aggression, as you'll hear in a few minutes, various members of Manson's family involved in the Tate-LaBianca killings acknowledged that they took speed before the murders. Now, the following is from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, where he discusses the controversial history of the Haight Ashbury Clinic and its connections to Charles Manson and the CIA. Quote, David Smith grew up in Bakersfield, California, about 2 hours north of Los Angeles. He never traveled much beyond his own town before moving to the Bay Area to study at UC Berkeley in 1960. At the end of 1965, a debilitating blackout and a messy breakup led him to giving up alcohol. By then, Dave was a 26-year-old postdoctoral student at UC San Francisco and the chief of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Screening Unit at San Francisco General Hospital. David recalls his curiosity flaring as his research collided with the city's cultural upheaval. I was injecting white rats with LSD in the lab, and then I'd walk home past Haight Ashbury, where I'd see kids who were high on the same substance. It was predicted that 100,000 young people would be coming to the area in the near future. David, who felt that healthcare was a right, wondered where these newcomers would receive medical attention and how they would afford it. He moved to Haight Ashbury himself with plans to start a free clinic. When it opened at 558 Clayton Street in June 1967, the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was an immediate sensation. Staffed entirely by volunteers and unauthorized by the city health department, it treated hundreds of patients a day, offering non-judgmental care for those suffering from bad trips, overdoses, sexually transmitted diseases, and malnourishment, or for those who just needed a kind ear. Lines at the clinic sometimes stretched around the block, with hippies waiting to ascend the creaky wooden stairs to its second-floor office. Inside, loitering was encouraged. The clinic did everything it could to advertise its psychedelic affinities. Exam rooms were painted in aqua and day-glow orange. One of them was wallpapered with a vibrant collage of peace signs, naked bodies, and hypnotic swirls. Even as David struggled to pay the rent and keep the cops at bay, he reveled in his creation. Few things so perfectly encapsulated the utopian ideals of the summer of love. As faces filed in and out of the clinic that summer, David and his colleagues befriended the repeat visitors. The clinic became a scene within a scene. It could be hard to tell the hippies apart with their long, beflowered hair, their upstart communes, their shifting legions of followers and leaders. But decades later, no one at the clinic had any trouble remembering Charles Manson and his girls. In 1971, David Smith published Love Needs Care, a memoir about the clinic's early years. I found it rife with details about Manson and the family during the Summer of Love, when Manson, apparently at his most charismatic, began to attract followers and ensure their unconditional devotion. Better still, Love Needs Care had a few contributions from Roger Smith, offering his own appraisal of Manson. As invaluable as these portraits are, however, I called them into question when my reporting led me to doubt both Roger and David. The more I reread certain passages, the more they seem like gingerly public relations efforts. David and Roger had to make it clear that they knew Manson well, but of course the book came out 2 years after the murders, when both David and Roger had an interest in distancing themselves from that Manson, the murderous one, the metaphor for evil. Love Needs Care attempts the delicate task of explaining the relationship the Smiths had with Manson, while making it seem as if they had no idea that he and his followers would someday erupt into unconscionable violence. David Smith described the Manson family's frequent trips to the clinic, where Charlie's girls, as they were known around the halls, were treated for STDs and pregnancies. The girls tended to Manson's every need, never speaking unless spoken to. When the family moved to an apartment on Cole Street, Manson began in earnest to reprogram his followers. David had an elaborate sense of Manson's tactics, although he never explained where he got it. Using a combination of LSD and mind games, Manson forced his followers to submit to unconventional sexual practices, as David wrote. Manson would invoke mysticism and pop psychology as the acid took hold, saying, "You have to negate your ego." Manson treated the girls like objects, eroded their independence, and turned them into quote-unquote self-acknowledged computers, empty vessels that would accept almost anything he poured in. They obeyed him unquestioningly. Acid, LSD, was unmistakably essential to the process. Interestingly, David thought Manson's insistence on LSD sometimes put him at odds with the trends in Haight Ashbury. Typically, hippies who dropped a lot of acid eventually moved on to another type of drug, speed. A schism grew within the scene. The acid heads preferred nonviolence, whereas the speed freaks caused the rash of violence which destroyed the Haight's live and let live ethos. The Manson family's drug pattern was effectively reversed, with Manson urging his disciples to relinquish speed and embrace acid. Steering his recruits away from speed, amphetamines from uppers, reduced the chance of interference with his induction process. Speed became a part of the family's lifestyle only later, David told me, when it came time to kill in Los Angeles. He'd heard this from Manson killer Susan Atkins herself when she asked him to assess her mental health for a parole hearing in 1978. When they went to southern Los Angeles, they got very deeply involved in speed, David said. They got it from the Hells Angels. In David's words, they were trading sex for speed, and Atkins thinks that Helter Skelter and the ultimate crime was a paranoid speed delusion. Prosecutor Bugliosi kept any mention of the family's speed use out of the trial. David thought he understood why. It risked presenting mitigating circumstances for the prosecution. And the defense wouldn't want it coming up either. No one wants his or her clients to look like addicts. Over the years, a smattering of evidence and first-hand recollections has suggested that the Manson family used amphetamines more than was originally thought. In a 2009 documentary, Linda Kasabian claimed that she and her companions each swallowed a capsule of speed before leaving for Cielo Drive, the night of Sharon Tate's murder. During the Manson trials, however, she had testified that she hadn't taken any drugs around the time of the murders. In books and at parole hearings, Susan Atkins also later stated that she had taken speed before the Tate murders. Tex Watson wrote that he frequently snorted it with the group and that he too took it on both nights of the murders. Others added that the family kept an abundance of speed at the Spahn Ranch towards the end of their time there, and that Manson himself wasn't above taking it, especially as he grew more paranoid. He would use it to stay awake for days at a time. Remember, Manson's parole officer Roger Smith sent him to live in Haight Ashbury because he thought the Haight Ashbury's quote-unquote vibes would help neutralize Manson's hostility. Make no mistake, Roger did believe that Manson was hostile. In a short essay for Life magazine published months after the murders, Roger offered his first ever insights about Manson. Charlie was the most hostile parolee I've ever come across, Roger wrote. Manson told me right off there was no way he could keep the terms of his parole. He was headed back to the joint and there was no way out of it. Roger would seldom write or speak about Manson again, wanting to distance himself from his most infamous client. When I first spoke to him in 2001, I was only the third reporter to do so. His remark about Manson's hostility always stayed with me. After all, I had already seen how Roger characterized Manson in official parole documents as a well-behaved guy making quote-unquote excellent progress. This disparity suggested that Roger had been willing to sweep Manson's hostility under the rug. In a passage he contributed to Love Needs Care, Roger did his best to support the idea that the bizarreness of Haight Ashbury suited Manson. Daily LSD trips made Manson mellower, more thoughtful. He was still a master manipulator, but he was suddenly fond of vacuous self-help philosophies like, if you love everything, you don't need to think about what bothers you. Roger couldn't seem too credulous, so he made sure to note the messianic tilt of Manson's acid days, an oblique acknowledgement of Manson's growing megalomania. David Smith mirrored the sentiment. David wrote that Manson's LSD trips replaced his quote-unquote underlying depression with a maniac smile. David admitted that Manson, quote-unquote, began to develop a number of delusions as his involvement with LSD progressed. Manson fantasized about the Beatles ordaining him as their musical equal. He imagined a judgment day when blacks would slaughter whites. Some of Roger's familiars, including his wife, couldn't understand his affinity for Manson. Roger was, quote-unquote, pretty much in awe of Charlie's ability to draw these women to him, one person said. Another thought that he was, quote-unquote, always kind of fascinated with the charismatic sociopath. After Manson's role in the Tate-LaBianca murders came out, Rogers allowed that he, quote-unquote, had made an error in bringing him to Haight Ashbury. But at the time, the family enjoyed a remarkable kinship with Roger. They swarmed over Roger and often filled the clinic reception room, bringing operations to a standstill, David Smith wrote. Among the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic alumni I spoke to, the understanding was that Manson had visited the clinic on many occasions to see Roger for their mandatory parole meetings. Roger himself would later claim that the Manson family simply came by out of the blue for no particular reason and, that they didn't begin seeing him there until after his duties as Manson's parole officer had ended. In either case, something about this arrangement didn't sit well with me. One reason the Haight Ashbury Clinic was free, after all, was that David, Roger, and their colleagues had received private and federal grants to conduct drug research there. Both Roger and David were studying amphetamines and LSD, the latter being the crucial component to Manson's reprogramming process. How had an uneducated ex-con like Manson, someone who months ago had never taken acid and maybe never even heard of it, come to use the drug to such sophisticated ends? And wasn't it suspicious, at least, that he was coming to the medical clinic to see two people, David and Roger, who were studying that very phenomenon, the use of drugs to control and change behavior? At least one friend of Roger's had foreseen that it would be a quote-unquote conflict of interest. I always thought there would be problems. Another person noted, Roger had really made a career at that point in trying to help Manson. He was going to soothe the savage beast. But unfortunately, instead, the beast grew more savage than ever. When he started the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, David Smith left a loose end dangling in his past. David never actually received his PhD in pharmacology. He'd completed a 2-year research project on amphetamines and their effects on groups of confined mice, but he never finished his dissertation. This surprised many of his closest friends, and in our interviews, David was reluctant to admit it. It wasn't like him to leave something undone. Even in its unpublished form, David Smith's research on mice defined him. In my own obsessive way, I found as much of this research as I could. I saw that Dave had published a brief article based on his study in the Haight Ashbury Medical Clinic's own house paper, the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, in 1969. It wasn't nearly as robust as his full thesis would have been, but it gave me something to go on. Before long, I was noticing parallels between David Smith's mice and the Manson family. At first, I was inclined to disregard these as the product of my more speculative side. I saw no purpose in linking the behavior of mice in a controlled experiment to the behavior of people in the world at large. But I took another look when I saw that Dave Smith himself had made such a connection. He spoke of his mice as proxies for human beings. His research started with 16 albino mice. With the same assistance of other researchers, he separated these two into groups of 8 in aggregate settings. Small, closely confined communities intended to stimulate crowding. They injected the mice with amphetamines. Over the next 24 hours, they transformed from docile animals into frantic combatants, fighting one another until they died either from injuries, self-inflicted wounds from over-grooming, or simple exhaustion. The violence was unremitting. Dave Smith described quote-unquote frenzied attacks of unrelenting rage. Afterward, all that remained in the blood-spattered cages were scattered, dismembered body parts. Simply by confining the animals in close quarters, he'd increased the toxicity of the amphetamines more than 4 times. In another attempt, some of the mice were dosed with other chemicals before they received amphetamine injections. The extra drugs sometimes had a sorting effect, segregating the mice that would kill from the mice that wouldn't. Or they had a soothing effect, all but eliminating the violent tendencies. David Smith told me he'd started his research having foreseen an influx of amphetamine abusers in San Francisco. He didn't say how he'd predicted that influx, but he was right. In the summer of 1967, as he opened his clinic, amphetamines exploded in popularity in Haight Ashbury. David Smith told me, quote-unquote, when the speed scene hit, it was a total shock to everybody. Suddenly, what I learned in pharmacology relative to amphetamines was now applicable to people. Throughout his work, Love Needs Care, David Smith draws parallels between the rodents he'd studied and the speed-addled hippies in the Haight. The mice on speed, he wrote, became inordinately aggressive and assaultive, turning upon one another with unexpected savagery. Their violent behavior is probably intensified by confinement, for it is strikingly similar to that observed in amphetamine abusers who consume the drugs in crowded atmospheres. In the Haight, David Smith watched as people took huge doses of speed, inspiring paranoia and hallucinations. Once peaceful and well-adjusted, the speed freaks of San Francisco lashed out with murderous rage at any real or imagined intrusion, assaulting, raping, or torturing to relieve the paranoid tension. As David Smith concluded, quote-unquote, cut off from the straight world, crammed together in inhumane conditions and controlled by chemicals, they behaved quite naturally like rats in a cage. But when I spoke to David Smith, he was quick to discount these parallels. I happened to study amphetamines before they hit Haight Ashbury, he said. The Haight didn't give me the idea. It's kind of like a historical accident. I was studying LSD before LSD hit the Haight. Now, according to Dr. Eugene Schoenfeld, who participated in a portion of Dave Smith's rat research in 1965, LSD was an integral component of the project. David and his colleagues would inject the rats with LSD in hopes of making them more suggestible before he gave them amphetamines. Suggestibility was among the most prized effects of LSD from a clinical perspective, and yet David kept LSD out of the official documentation of his research. The article he had published in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs never mentioned acid. I asked David if LSD was part of his protocol. He denied it. Then, a moment later, without provocation, he reversed himself. Yes, I stuck LSD in them, he said. But he couldn't explain why. I was sticking all different kinds of drugs in them, he added. In his recollection, LSD, quote-unquote, produced disorganized behavior, but not violent behavior. The rats would just wander around in a daze. If you've noticed that I've used rats and mice interchangeably, there's a reason for that. David Smith used them interchangeably too, even though rats and mice have two vastly different behavioral patterns, especially in groups. In his Journal of Psychedelic Drugs article, he calls them mice. In Love Needs Care and another book he published, they're rats. Schoenfeld insisted that he'd work with rats during this part of the research, but Smith was adamant that they were mice, and he couldn't explain his confusion on the subject. According to his own academic papers, some of David Smith's research was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. This organization, the National Institute of Mental Health, has acknowledged that the CIA used it as a front for LSD research. And, though David never mentioned it in his writing, his work owed a clear debt to the landmark research of another National Institute of Mental Health psychologist, John B. Cahoon, who'd studied rat populations since 1946. Cahoon reported that rats in confined groups, even without drugs, became uncharacteristically aggressive. They'd erupt into rape, murder, cannibalism, and infanticide, killing babies. A dominant male rat emerged, subjugating other males into a tribe of cowering and feeble followers, and organizing female rats into a quote-unquote harem of sex slaves. The strangest group to emerge were hypersexualized male rats that stalked and raped both males and females and often cannibalized their young. These hypersexualized male rats would commit frenzied and berserk attacks against rat families sleeping in their burrows, leaving the remains of half-eaten victims. Again, no drugs were involved here. These hyper-aggressive rats emerged simply as a result of their confinement. They deferred only to the dominant male rat, fleeing if he caught sight of them. Cahoon's study was a watershed. In the mid-60s, amid growing concerns about population density, social scientists, politicians, and journalists cited his work to explain the riots in America's overcrowded ghettos. Calhoun's term, the quote-unquote behavioral sink, entered the scientific lexicon almost right away. The behavioral sink is defined as, quote, the outcome of any behavioral process that collects animals together in unusually great numbers, aggravating all forms of pathology that can be found within the group. David Smith used this term extensively, behavioral sink, in his writing and in his interviews with me. Though David never mentioned Cahoon by name, his research was essentially a continuation. He sought to control the pathology of rats, or mice, in crowded environments by aggravating them with amphetamines. He concluded that amphetamines were more toxic to rats in groups than rats alone. Their crowding essentially exasperated the effects of the stimulant, and this conclusion, like so much in David's research, confused me. I didn't see how it could be objective and unbiased. According to Cahoon, the rat's violence wasn't intensified by the confinement, but rather it was created by it. Therefore, what difference did it make if David shot them up with amphetamines? It seemed like the equivalent of studying drunk, inexperienced ice skaters to learn about alcohol intoxication. The novice skaters were going to fall down on the ice anyway, regardless of whether they'd been drinking or not. Plus, the more interesting subtleties of Cahoon's research, the emergence of a dominant male rat, a harem of suburban females, and an underclass of other males, all of which, it had to be said, sounded a lot like the Manson family, had gone entirely unnoted in David's project. I wondered if amphetamines, with or without LSD, had increased the dominant male's grip on his followers. Given how eerily David's research prefigured the creation of the Manson family under David's nose in the Haight Ashbury during the summer of '67, I wondered if he had deliberately underreported it. I've never come close to proving that he did, but I haven't been able to explain the holes in it either. Why would David use LSD to induce suggestibility in rats before injecting them with amphetamines and making them berserk? Past a certain point, David had little interest in helping me sort it out. I once said to him, I was just talking about the parallels to what happened with the Manson family, and when I try to describe your research, I just keep getting hung up on. In response, David said the following, well then, why don't you just forget about the research? Just delete the whole thing from your book. It was important, I said. In response, David followed up, you're spending way too much of your and my time on it. When Roger Smith joined forces with the clinic to start the ARP, the Amphetamine Research Project, he was picking up where David left off. But this time, the research involved people. This meant that both Smiths, David and Roger, and Manson were often in the same place. At the same time, with both Roger and David having received funding from a federal institute later revealed to be a CIA front. In David's words, it was, in a certain sense, coincidental. Roger was the head of the Speed Project, and Charlie came to the Haight and visited Roger. Manson didn't come to be part of the Speed Research Project, it was just that Roger happened to be his parole officer. Again, that's what David said. Details on the ARP and on the pharmacological goings-on at the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic more generally were hard to come by. The reams of record-keeping you'd expect from clinical experimentation simply weren't there. Stephan Patel, a forensic psychologist who'd worked with both Smiths at the clinic, volunteered a stunning bit of information that Roger and David had neglected to share with me. The only thing I remember about ARP was that it got burglarized one night and Roger lost all of his files, Patel told me. Their disappearance had been jarring in part because Roger was a quote-unquote unusually paranoid guy to begin with. He was especially skittish about Manson. After the murders, Roger refused to discuss him with anyone. Stephan Patel assumed that Roger didn't want to be blamed for quote-unquote directing Manson to the Haight. In Stephan's words, Roger felt that people were saying that he was the one who put the toxins into the environment. The medical clinic's original chief psychiatrist, Dr. Ernest Dernberg, remembered the theft of the ARP files as well. As he recalled, they'd gone missing right after the announcement of Manson's arrest for the Tate-LaBianca murders, and that quote-unquote Roger, understandably, was pretty upset. Nothing else was taken from the medical clinic, which led the staff to believe that the police or some federal agency might have removed the files. These were research papers, Dr. Ernest reminded me. It didn't make sense for someone to steal these things when they didn't have any inherent value to the average individual. It seemed to have a more nefarious purpose. David and Roger, however, both denied that the theft had ever happened. You're dealing with aging memories, David said. But Dernberg and Patel, full-time doctors and credible sources, I thought, stood by their stories. They were absolutely stolen, Patel said. Dernberg, perturbed by David's insinuation about his faculties, told me more that he remembered. In Dernberg's words, it was a considerable amount of research, the premier amphetamine research conducted at a street level. It would have been very important to the clinic. And it disappeared. Call David. Ask Roger if he has the files or knows where they are. Again, that was from Dernberg. Both Roger and David said they had no idea. Now, what have survived are the many issues of the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, the clinic's in-house research organ. David Smith founded it in 1967, and at various points both he and Roger served on its editorial board. In the late 60s and early 70s, the journal printed a raft of articles by David and other clinicians about the long-term effects of LSD and amphetamines. One of these articles hoped to find out whether a dramatic drug-induced experience would have a lasting impact on the individual's personality. Another observed that feelings of frustrated anger led people to want to try LSD. The soil from which the flower children arise, the author wrote, is filled with more anger and aggression, thorn and thistles, rather than passion and petunias. Under emotional pressure, acid could induce images and sensations of anger or hate magnified into nightmarish proportions. David Smith had studied these same phenomena, formulating an idea that he called the psychedelic syndrome, first articulated in 1967 or early 68. The gist was that acid, when taken by groups of like-minded people, led to a chronic LSD state that reinforced the interpretation of quote-unquote psychedelic reality. The more often the same group of friends dropped acid, the more they encouraged one another to adopt the worldview they discovered together on LSD, thus producing dramatic psychological changes. Usually, the psychedelic syndrome was harmless, but regular LSD use could cause, quote-unquote, the emergence of a dramatic orientation to mysticism. And in people with pre-psychotic personalities, Smith wrote, LSD precipitated a long-term psychological disorder, usually a depressive reaction or a schizophrenic process. Had David seen this quote-unquote syndrome in the Manson family? After Manson had been arrested for the murders, David wrote, Charlie could probably be diagnosed as ambulatory schizophrenic. He said the same thing when I asked him about Manson. I felt he was schizo. It was Roger Smith who'd had the better diagnosis and the earlier one, David maintained. In David's words, Roger said that he knew from day one that Charlie was a psychopath. But Roger apparently never thought it was necessary to intervene, to send his parolee back to prison or to get him proper psychiatric care. Instead, he sent him to the Haight and watched him drop acid every day, accruing suggestible young followers as he went. Meanwhile, David was studying the exact psychological conditions that gave rise to the Manson family while he treated them at his clinic. Now, Roger Smith knew that the stereotype of the addict had a lot of potency in the popular imagination. Casual drug users were regarded as inherently criminal, a tear in the fabric of society. The public's fear of such people was easily manipulated. In 1966, the year before Manson was released from prison, Roger published a criminology paper called Status, Politics, and the Image of the Addict. This paper examined the propaganda that stigmatized the Chinese, or Oriental as he put it, opium smokers in San Francisco in the early 20th century. Citing police files and strategy manuals, Roger described an organized effort to cast opium addicts, who were by and large peaceful, as insidious deviants who posed a threat to society. To this end, some agents were assigned to pose as drug addicts and infiltrate the opium scene. Their objective was to, quote-unquote, characterize the addict as a dangerous individual, likely to rob, rape, or plunder in his crazed state. And it worked. The once invisible opium users of San Francisco's Chinese ghettos were, by 1925, depicted in the media as crazed dope fiends. The shift in public perception allowed the police to crack down on the Chinese population, deporting or institutionalizing the undesirables. Roger never valorized nor condemned these efforts, but he noted that they were effective. In Rogers's words, the Orientals were viewed as a threat to the existing structure of life in this country. Tainting their image meant that they could be differentiated and degraded to the satisfaction of society. It's not hard to see how such research could be applied to the Haight Ashbury hippies in the late 60s. Most Americans frowned on acid, as they frown on all drugs, but it took Charles Manson to give LSD new and fearsome dimensions. Suddenly, it caused violence, and the hippies who used it were perceived as wild-eyed and dangerous, whereas once they'd been harmless pleasure seekers. The Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic's goal, free healthcare for everyone, was an unimpeachable part of the hippie ethic. There could be no doubt that David Smith and his volunteer doctors had improved the community. But just because the clinic had free in its name didn't mean that it had no cost. The place served as a gateway between the hippie world and the straight world, affording doctors a closer look at the hierarchies and nuances of the counterculture. In exchange for their quote-unquote free healthcare, patients were held up to the light and scrutinized by eager researchers, David Smith chief among them. Emmett Grogan, founder of The Diggers, was one of a few observers who saw something amiss behind David's idealism. The Diggers were an anarchist group known for providing food, housing, and medical aid to runaways in the Bay Area. David liked them and worked with them at a free infirmary based out of their Happening House. It inspired his own clinic. But as Grogan wrote in his 1972 memoir, the admiration wasn't mutual, at least not for long. In Grogan's words, Smith soon, quote-unquote, began his own self-aggrandizement. He appeared more concerned with the pharmacology of the situation than with treating the ailing people who came to him for help. Grogan noticed that David kept detailed records about drugs and their abuse. These David used to secure funding for the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which he opened only 6 weeks after he joined the Diggers operation. Grogan saw through the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic's mission statement right away. In Grogan's words, just because no one was made to pay a fee when they went there didn't make it a free clinic. On the contrary, the patients were treated as research subjects, and the facility was used to support whatever medical innovations were new and appropriate to the agency. Again, that was from Emmett Grogan. Of course, one of these patients was Manson, who became one of David Smith's research subjects as well. Manson was such a special case that David tracked him far beyond the walls of the clinic, sending his top researcher all the way down to Los Angeles, where Manson and his ranks of followers had set up shop on the time-worn western sets of the Spahn Ranch. End quote. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Spahn Ranch itself. When the Manson family left San Francisco when they moved down from Haight Ashbury to Los Angeles, they eventually settled permanently at Spahn Ranch. Well, what exactly was Spahn Ranch and why did they live there? I'm going to go over all those details right now. What exactly happened to Spahn Ranch? Is it still a thing? Can you still go visit it? Well, today, Spahn Ranch no longer exists. It's completely gone. I'll be discussing exactly what happened soon. But first, what exactly was Spahn Ranch? How did it start? In 1947, a couple named Lee and Ruth McReynolds opened the Spahn Ranch movie set in Chatsworth, Los Angeles. Chatsworth is a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley area, which is very dry, very rugged. It's perfect for a Western-style ranch. However, this ranch that the McReynolds opened in 1947 wouldn't be called Spahn Ranch until after they sold the site in 1953 to a dairy farmer named George Spahn. In any case, one of the reasons the McReynolds opened this ranch in the first place at this particular location in Chatsworth is because just a few minutes away from them was another Western-themed filming location, a place called the Iverson Movie Ranch. Some major actors of the time had film productions at the Iverson Movie Ranch. More on that shortly. The McReynolds were hoping that by building their own ranch nearby, they could get some film industry work as well. Indeed, several productions ended up being filmed at the ranch, mostly lesser-known productions, however. The biggest production thought to have been filmed at least in part at the ranch was The Lone Ranger, a show by ABC Television starring Clayton Moore. The show aired on ABC from 1949 to 1957. Now, unfortunately for George Spahn, the popularity of Westerns declined throughout the 60s. Filming productions at the ranch wasn't enough to keep things afloat for George Spahn. Enter the Manson family. In 1968, Charles Manson and his followers came to the ranch. They didn't pay to stay there, but they did help George maintain the ranch, and George also enjoyed the quote-unquote favors the Manson girls would do for him. In particular, George Spahn had a relationship with Squeaky Fromme, who was about 60 years younger than him. And thus, with all that said, with this arrangement in place, Manson and his family turned Spahn Ranch into their permanent new home. Interestingly, even after the Manson killings in August of 1969, several of the family members, as well as George Spahn himself, continued to live at the ranch. They lived there until it was burned down by a fire in September of 1970. On September 22, 1974, George Spahn passed away. He was 85 years old. Now, the following is an article which goes deeper into the detail of the history of Spahn Ranch and the Manson family. This is from allthat'sinteresting.com by Katie Serena. Quote, "Before the Manson family lived at Spahn Ranch, it was indeed a movie set. In 1947, Lee and Ruth McReynolds purchased a 55-acre plot of land at the western edge of Los Angeles County. On this land, they opened a trading post and built a Western-themed movie set. Not far away from them, the Iverson Movie Ranch had been the location for films starring John Wayne and Buster Keaton. Lee McReynolds was hoping to catch some of that overflow. McReynolds built his sets, but in 1953, he sold them to a man named George Spahn, who owned it until his death about 20 years later. George Spahn had a successful milk business in Pennsylvania, where he was born. By the time he took his wife and 11 children to sunny California, he had grown his enterprise to 35 cows, 5 wagons, and 7 houses. After moving to the West Coast, Spahn operated a ranch out of North Hollywood and grew to be a major supplier of livestock and Western props for motion pictures. Soon, George Spahn split with his wife, who took the kids. In turn, George started a romance with an ex-circus performer named Ruby Pearl. As the owner of Spahn Ranch, Spahn added several more Western-themed sets. Multiple B-movies were shot at the ranch. Howard Hughes' film The Outlaw was one of the most notable, along with several episodes of TV's hit Western Bonanza. But as Westerns began to lose popularity, Spahn was forced to diversify. The ranch became primarily a tourist spot, and horse rentals helped keep Spahn's business afloat. The ranch was perfect for horseback riding with various hillside trails, dry riverbeds, and mountaintop overlooks. But in 1968, it played host to a mystical, maniacal cult leader and his band of loyal followers, who took advantage of Spahn Ranch's isolation to plot a gruesome series of murders. In 1968, the year before the murder of Sharon Tate, Charles Manson was freshly homeless and looking for lodging for his quote-unquote family, a group of young people who had chosen to follow his mystical teachings and wild lectures. The isolated Spahn Ranch on the outskirts of Los Angeles was perfect. By that point, George Spahn was 80 years old. George had spent the last 15 years as a dairy farmer running the horseback riding rentals from the home on his ranch, living a relatively quiet life. The Manson family, on the other hand, had lived in anything but relative quiet. Famously, in the summer of 1968, several of Manson's girls, over a dozen of them, lived with Dennis Wilson, drummer from the Beach Boys. After a falling out with Wilson, the family was on the move again. Charles Manson was intrigued by Spahn Ranch's isolation and rugged terrain. He thought it would be the perfect place for his cult. For his part, George Spahn was happy to have a group of young people move in, especially when they offered to exchange labor for lodging. Troubled by mental health issues later in life, Spahn was going blind and had increasing trouble moving around on his own. He was all too happy to have a group of able-bodied youngsters around him to help him and Ruby maintain the ranch. And of course, he was keen on Manson's trove of young female followers. Having his way with Manson's women was part of the deal. Over the months that the Manson family lived on the Spahn Ranch, George Spahn and the family developed a rapport. Spahn gave several of the family members nicknames which ended up becoming famous. For instance, George Spahn assigned the nickname Squeaky to Lynette Frome. Lynette was Spahn's favorite girl and his de facto wife. He called her Squeaky because apparently that was a noise she used to make when he would run his hand up her thigh. The other Charles in the group, Charles Watson, was called Tex after his Texas accent, which George Spahn recognized immediately. But while George Spahn enjoyed the young women and the newcomers in general on his ranch, and indeed spent hours chumming with them, he was completely unaware of the horrors they were plotting. Spahn Ranch had no newspapers, no clocks, and no regular visitors, allowing Manson to enforce a sense of timelessness in his followers that made them even more susceptible to his influence. The culmination of Manson's disturbing teachings took place in August of 1969, when Manson family members Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian drove on Manson's orders from Spahn Ranch to the house of actress Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski at 150 Cielo Drive. 5 people were killed that night, 6 if you include Sharon Tate's unborn child. The victims were Stephen Parent, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Sharon Tate, and her unborn child. These murders took place early in the morning on August 9th of 1969. On August 10th, the Manson family killed again, this time the LaBianca couple. After the killers were eventually caught, Spahn Ranch became center stage for much of the aftermath. As a matter of fact, Charles Manson was even arrested at Spahn Ranch. Interestingly, despite the fact that Tate-LaBianca murders were planned at the ranch, despite the fact that the Manson members hid at the ranch following the bloodshed, and despite the fact George Spahn had been involved sexually with several members of the Manson family, George Spahn never faced any charges for involvement with the family. George Spahn, as well as many members of the family, lived on the farm for a year following Manson's arrest, until a wildfire burned down most of the ranch in September of 1970. In September of 1974, George Spahn died. He was 85 years old. Today, not much remains of the Spahn Ranch. After being ravaged by the 1970 wildfire as well as another one years later, the land was repurchased by the state of California. Now it's mostly dirt and brush." End quote. Now, as mentioned in this article, before moving to Spahn Ranch, many of the Manson members lived at the house of Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boys drummer. And it was through Dennis that Manson befriended Neil Young. I'm going to go over all of that now. Manson played some songs for me sitting in Dennis Wilson's house. Charlie was always there. Charles Manson and Neil Young not only knew each other, but Neil Young tried to help Charles get signed to a record deal. The two of them were friendly enough that Neil Young even gave Charles Manson a motorcycle as a gift. Yes, a motorcycle. Neil Young himself has said he did this. I'll be sharing that quote with you in a few minutes. After the Manson murders, Neil Young wrote a song based on Charles Manson and the killings. As a matter of fact, Neil Young's friends, particularly David Crosby, were very uncomfortable with that song. I'll be discussing that as well in detail later in this video, but first, how did the connection between Manson and Neil Young even start? In the summer of 1968, over a dozen of Charlie Manson's girls lived in the house of Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. Charles Manson was frequently over at Dennis Wilson's house, which is where he met Neil Young, another close friend of Dennis Wilson's. The following is from journalist Lee Thomas for Far Out magazine. Quote, "Neil Young semi-regularly encountered Charles Manson. Manson was often at the house of Beach Boys co-founder Dennis Wilson. Neil Young would also visit Dennis's house regularly. Thus, somewhat bizarrely, Neil Young had jammed with Manson. Neil Young even helped Manson write new music. Furthermore, Neil Young gave Charles Manson a motorcycle as a gift, and Neil Young tried to help Manson secure a professional record deal. He was impressed by Manson's creative songwriting ability and saw the success that Manson's captivating persona could have. As Neil Young himself once recalled, he spoke to Warner Brothers executive Mo Ostin about Manson. "I told Mo Ostin about him. This guy, Charles, is unbelievable. He makes up songs as he goes along, and they're all good." But regardless, the label wasn't interested. In any case, Neil Young once told journalist Nick Kent that Manson was great. He was unreal. "I met him maybe 2-3 times at Dennis Wilson's house. I spent the afternoon with him, Dennis, and all those girls, Linda Kasabian, Squeaky Fromme, the girls, though they only paid attention to Charlie. He was an angry man, but brilliant. Wrong, but stone brilliant. He sounds like Bob Dylan when he talks." In quite possibly the biggest understatement about Manson you'll hear, Young later added, "He seemed a little uptight, a little too intense. He was a frustrated artist and spent a lot of time in jail. As a songwriter, he would make up songs as he went along. New stuff all the time, no two songs he did were the same. I remember playing a little guitar while he was making up songs. Strong will, that guy. He's like one of the main movers and shakers of the time, but he was kind of skewed. You can tell by reading his words, he's really smart, very deceptive." Manson, speaking in 1995 from his prison cell in California, told an interviewer that at the time he was trying to break into the music industry in the late 60s, no one gave him anything apart from Neil Young, who curiously and perhaps a bit randomly gave Manson a motorcycle. After being informed of Manson's interview, Young replied, "Charlie remembers me, huh? Everybody else ripped him off, but I gave him a motorcycle. I turned out to be a good guy." End of article. So, according to Neil Young, he had only met Charles Manson 2 to 3 times, yet he literally gave him a motorcycle as a gift. Now, I've been trying to find the context as to why he gave him that motorcycle, but nothing really explanatory is popping up anywhere. In any case, gifting a literal motorcycle is a pretty big gesture, especially when you consider Neil Young is claiming he only met Manson possibly 2 times. In respect to Neil Young, I'll take him for his word, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but it just comes across a bit unrealistic that you would gift a guy a motorcycle you've only met 2 to 3 times, and that you would advocate for him to get a record deal with one of the biggest record executives in the country. It just comes across a bit hard to believe, I'm going to be honest here, but again, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. In any case, the following is about Charles Manson and Neil Young by Alison Rapp for Ultimate Classic Rock. Quote, "Before he was a convicted murderer, Charles Manson was an aspiring musician who at one point rubbed shoulders with Neil Young. That was thanks to Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Wilson and Manson had become friends in 1968, occasionally making music, hanging out with girls, and experimenting with drugs. None of which would have raised too many eyebrows at the time, even if Manson appeared a bit more intense than the other people around him. Sometime, Charlie Manson, who's a friend of mine, says he's God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry. Dennis Wilson said that to Rave magazine in 1968. In 2017, Dennis's Beach Boys bandmate Mike Love recalled the following to ABC News. Dennis was enthralled by him at one point, and it didn't hurt that Manson came with this group of girls, young girls who were very enamored with Charlie and looked up to him as a leader. Again, that was from Mike Love, Dennis's former bandmate. It seemed that as far as Dennis Wilson was concerned, Manson was simply an eccentric but well-liked upcoming artist who had an interest in pursuing music more seriously. Charles had expressed a desire to meet with the executive Mo Ostin from Reprise Records, Warner Brothers. And so Wilson introduced Charles to Neil Young. Neil Young was signed to that record label and he knew Mo Ostin. Like Dennis, Young also found Manson to be somewhat over-the-top and strange, but creative nevertheless. He had this kind of music that no one was doing, Young explained in a 1985 interview with writer Bill Flanagan. Young would add the following. Charles would sit down with the guitar and start playing and making up stuff, different every time. It just kept coming out, coming out, coming out. Then he would stop, and you would never hear that one again. Musically, I thought he was very unique. I thought he really had something crazy, something great. He was like a living poet. He had a lot of girls around at the time, and I thought, well, this guy has a lot of girlfriends. Again, that was from a 1985 interview with Neil Young. In 2012, Neil Young wrote the following in his biography, Waging Heavy Peace. Manson's songs were off-the-cuff things he made up as he went along, and they were never the same twice in a row. Kind of like Bob Dylan, but different because it was hard to glimpse a true message in them. But nevertheless, Manson's songs were fascinating. He was quite good. Now, in terms of Neil Young saying that Manson was quite good, Manson was able to even audition for producer Terry Melcher, who'd worked on the first 2 albums for the Byrds. However, Melcher declined to sign Manson, and both he and Dennis Wilson moved on from the relationship. Of course, nothing ever became of Manson's music career. In 1971, he was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people, including actress Sharon Tate. The murders, of course, took place in August of 1969. In 1985, Neil Young said the following: "I don't know why he did what he did, but I think Manson was very frustrated in not being able to get a record deal, and he blames somebody. But I don't know what happened. I don't know what they got into. I remember there was a lot of energy whenever he was around, and Manson was different. You could tell he was different. All you have to do is look at him. Once you've seen him, you can never forget him. I'll tell you that. There's just something about him that's... I just can't forget it. I don't know what you would even call it, but I wouldn't want to call it anything in an interview. I would just like to forget about it." Again, that was Neil Young in 1985. Now, not all that long after Manson's conviction in the early 70s, Neil Young wrote a song inspired by the events from the perspective of a bloodthirsty killer. That song was called Revolution Blues, and it appeared on his 1974 album On the Beach. The lyrics include the following: "Well, I heard that Laurel Canyon is full of famous stars, but I hate them worse than lepers, and I'll kill them in their cars." End of article. Revolution Blues is the 3rd track from Neil Young's album On the Beach. The album was released on July 19, 1974, about 5 years after the Manson murders. By 1974, Neil Young was a very famous, successful musician. On the Beach is his 5th solo album. However, when Neil Young first met Charles Manson in 1968, Neil was not yet nearly as famous as he would become. In 1968, Neil Young hadn't even released his first solo album yet. However, 2 years earlier, in 1966, Neil Young co-founded Buffalo Springfield, and by the time he met Manson in '68, Neil Young did have several well-established, powerful music industry connections, which Manson hoped to use to his advantage. Young did try to help Manson get a major label record deal, but of course that never panned out. As a quick side note, if Manson did get a record deal and became a famous musician, what would have happened to the Manson family? Would he have disbanded the family or kept them along as his loyal followers? More importantly, would some sort of murders still have taken place eventually? I am making a separate video that will explore these alternative timelines. Keep an eye out for that one. Now, going back to Neil Young, as mentioned, Revolution Blues is the 3rd track from his album On the Beach. It was not released as a single, though it is arguably the most famous song from the album. It's certainly the most controversial. Another famous musician, Neil Young's longtime collaborator David Crosby, played rhythm guitar on Revolution Blues. However, although David Crosby played on the album version of Revolution Blues, he did not feel comfortable playing that song live. As a matter of fact, even when it came to the album recording of that song, Crosby wasn't completely comfortable with it. According to the book, Neil Young, Long May You Run, David said to Neil, "Don't sing about that." David Crosby, of course, was referring to the dark subject matter of the lyrics. The following is from Stephen L. Jones for SingOut.com. Quote, "David Crosby at first wanted nothing to do with the song. Crosby was deeply spooked by the Manson murders and had a fear of overzealous, drugged-out fans. Plus, David Crosby was aware that Neil Young knew Charles Manson." End quote. After the Manson murders, David Crosby armed himself and famously stated, "They're killing all the people with estates." The following is from theweek.com. Quote, "Crosby is very afraid of being murdered. He owns guns for self-protection. After he was busted on a firearm charge in the 1980s, his public explanation for why he was carrying a weapon consisted of 2 words, John Lennon. He actually began carrying years earlier after the Manson gang committed the 1969 Sharon Tate murders. The Sharon Tate murders took place just a half-mile from Crosby's home. As David Crosby once recalled, "When that happened, I said, I think I'm going to go get me a 12-gauge shotgun." And I did. Later on, I got a .45 handgun. I've always been a gunner, it's just part of my thing. But no, it's not really based on a reasonable fear. I think you're probably better off calling 911. End quote. Bottom line, even though he plays on the studio recording of Revolution Blues, Neil Young's close friend David Crosby was not comfortable with that song. 1974, the year the song was released, also happened to be the year Neil Young and David Crosby's band, CSNY, had their reunion tour. CSNY ended up playing Revolution Blues live, which, according to Neil Young, made David Crosby very uncomfortable. In 1985, Neil Young said the following in an interview with NME, New Musical Express. Quote, "Well, in 1974, I wasn't touring solo at the time, so I ended up playing Revolution Blues on the CSNY tour instead. David Crosby especially was very uncomfortable." End quote. Again, the Charles Manson-inspired lyrics to the song are what bothered Crosby. For instance, in Revolution Blues, the lyric 10 million dune buggies is a reference to Manson's plan to assemble forces in the desert to carry out his race war. Of course, there's also the infamous closing lines of the song. "Well, I hear that Laurel Canyon is full of famous stars, but I hate them worse than lepers and I'll kill them in their cars." The following is from songfacts.com. Quote, "According to Neil Young, the biggest obstacle to Manson achieving fame was that he was so improvisational and unpredictable that a band wouldn't have been able to keep up with him. This was all before the murders, of course. Young has continued to be honest about the respect he had for Manson before the terrible crimes. Neil Young has insinuated that many other Laurel Canyon musicians felt the same way about Manson that he did, but none of them would be as willing to admit their association with him." End quote. In a 1985 interview, Neil Young said the following about Manson. Quote, "I can see these things in other people. You can see it and feel it. Manson would sing a song and just make it up as he went for 3 or 4 minutes, and he would never repeat one word, and it all made perfect sense. It shook you up to listen to it. It was so good that it scared you." End quote. I believe that interview was also with NME. Now, as mentioned earlier, Charles Manson did receive a motorcycle from Neil Young. As a matter of fact, Charles Manson did have ties with a notorious motorcycle gang called the Straight Satans. This idiotic motorcycle gang is actually one of the reasons the murder of Gary Hinman took place. I'll be getting back to Neil Young in just a minute, but first I want to touch on the Gary Hinman murder and how this motorcycle gang essentially triggered the first famous Manson-related killing. Gary Hinman was not a member of the Manson family. However, he got caught up in Manson family drama thanks largely to Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby himself was not a quote-unquote official member of the Manson family, but he was close to Charles Manson. In late July of 1969, Bobby Beausoleil bought mescaline, a psychedelic drug from Gary Hinman. According to some sources, including CharlesManson.com, Bobby bought the mescaline for the Manson-associated Straight Satan's motorcycle gang. The leader of the motorcycle gang, Danny DiCarlo, was even living at the Manson family Spahn ranch. The motorcycle gang, particularly Danny DiCarlo, were not happy with the quality of the drug Bobby Beausoleil bought them. Subsequently, Danny DiCarlo forced Bobby Beausoleil to go back to Gary Hinman's house and demand he return the money that was spent on the mescaline. Long story short, one thing led to another, and eventually Manson himself showed up at Gary's house and slashed Gary across the face with a knife. Here's the massive irony. Bobby Beausoleil initially asked Gary Hinman for $1,000. When Hinman refused to give it to him, there was an argument, but Bobby and Gary did eventually come to an agreement about some sort of compensation for the bad mescaline. This included Gary giving Bobby both of his cars. So, just as all that got settled, Manson arrived and slashed Gary in the face, setting into motion a series of terrible events. If Manson was able to control his temper and his violent tendencies, a lot of things would have been different. After slashing Gary in the face, Manson subsequently left the house and dumped the problem on Bobby to deal with. Gary Hinman, understandably, wanted to go to a hospital to get his injury looked after, but Bobby tried to stop him. He was afraid that Gary might talk to authorities about everything. Eventually, Bobby killed Gary Hinman. Again, all of this started because the motorcycle gang forced Bobby to go back to Gary's house. The following is from CharlesManson.com. Quote, "After Manson slashed Gary Hinman and left the house, Beausoleil eventually phoned Spahn Ranch and asked for advice on what to do. Manson came to the phone, told Beausoleil he was on his own, and hung up. Gary Hinman made additional demands to be allowed to go to the hospital. In a state of panic and desperation, Beausoleil made the decision to kill Hinman. Bobby stabbed Gary once in the chest. When Gary did not immediately fall, Bobby stabbed him a second time. In court testimony, the coroner said that the second stab wound was almost instantly fatal. At the crime scene, Bobby tried to make it look as though Hinman had been killed by someone else. Bobby drew the words political pig on the wall in Gary's blood. Bobby also painted an animal paw mark on the wall, supposedly to make it appear as though the Black Panthers did it. In a 1981 interview with Truman Capote, Bobby revealed that Gary Hinman stated he would disclose information about Manson attacking him. According to Bobby, that's why he killed him on July 27, 1969. A week and a half later, on August 6, 1969, Bobby was arrested in San Luis Obispo, about 3.5 hours north of Los Angeles. Bobby was driving one of Gary Hinman's vehicles. The car broke down on the freeway, and the knife used to kill Gary Hinman was in the car." End quote. The Gary Hinman murder essentially served as the quote-unquote blueprint for the Tate-LaBianca murders 2 weeks later. Death by knife stabbings and blood writings on the walls of the deceased. Manson killer Susan Atkins was present at Gary Hinman's house when Bobby Beausoleil killed him. There were actually 2 Manson girls present at Hinman's house when Bobby killed him, Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner. Mary was not involved in the Sharon Tate killings. Susan was. Early in the morning on August 9th, just 2 days after Bobby's arrest, Sharon Tate's house was attacked. Susan Atkins wrote the word pig on the front door of Sharon's house using Sharon's blood. Susan Atkins claimed she was inspired to do this because of what Bobby did at Gary's house. Remember, Bobby tried to frame the Black Panthers. Therefore, by doing the same type of blood writing at Sharon Tate's house, Susan and the other Manson family members were trying to make it seem as though the Panthers were also behind the Sharon Tate killings. If people learned that Sharon Tate was murdered by the Panthers in the same way Gary Hinman was killed by the Panthers, then Bobby Beausoleil would be viewed as innocent. It couldn't have been Bobby, it was the Black Panthers. This was the Manson family logic. Insane, but then again, the entire Manson family was insane. Bottom line, if you connect the dominoes, the Straight Satan's motorcycle gang set into motion the series of events which led to Gary Hinman's murder. So, with all that said, going back to Neil Young, I'm curious if the motorcycle Neil Young gifted Charles Manson wound up in the hands of the motorcycle gang. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that Neil Young had a connection with that gang, nor am I suggesting Neil Young was even aware of Manson's connection with the Straight Satans. But regardless, it would be interesting to know if the Neil Young motorcycle somehow ended up in the hands of the motorcycle gang. Anyways, now going back to the relationship between Neil Young and Charles Manson, the following is from thethings.com by Aya Tsintsiras. In this article, Neil Young is quoted as saying, "After a while, a guy showed up, picked up my guitar, and started playing songs on it." He's referring, of course, to Charles Manson. Now, what is not clear is where he says a guy showed up. Showed up where exactly? I'm assuming he's referring to Dennis Wilson's house, but it's not completely clear. Quote, "In his book, Young wrote something memorable about a surprising figure, Charles Manson. Young wrote that Manson's musical talents were similar to Bob Dylan's. As Neil Young wrote, after a while, a guy showed up, picked up my guitar, and started playing songs on it. His name was Charlie, kind of like Dylan, but different. As many publications have noted, Neil Young and Charles Manson seem to be at the same parties and have the same social circle. There's no evidence, however, that they were actually friends. And it's important to note that Young has only said positive things about Manson's music, not anything else. They didn't have a close friendship, but from what Neil Young has said, it sounds like him and Manson talked about music quite a lot. In the 60s, Neil Young wasn't the household name he is today, but he was working hard at his career. His debut self-titled album was released in 1968. By the end of the 70s, Young would be a massive rock star with many successful albums. Now, going back to his connection to Manson, Neil Young's song Revolution Blues from his 1974 album On the Beach was about Charles Manson's crimes. The lyrics are intense and paint a picture of the unnerving vibe in California at the time. Young wrote in the song, "Well, I'm a barrel of laughs with my carbine on. I keep 'em hoppin' till my ammunition's gone. But I'm still not happy. I feel like there's something wrong." Over the years, Neil Young doesn't seem to have said much about this specific song. Perhaps because he said everything he wanted to say in the lyrics. End of article. Now, I want to share with you guys the history of Charles Manson's friendship with Dennis Wilson. It's really eye-opening, and it shows how not just Dennis Wilson, but several industry people in Hollywood were connected to Manson. For those of you who've been following my channel for a while, I did share this information in a previous video. But for those of you who are new here, here's the story of Dennis Wilson and Charles Manson. Why didn't Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher report Charles Manson to the police after the Tate-LaBianca murders? For context, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys and record producer Terry Melcher both knew Manson personally, especially Dennis Wilson. During the summer of 1968, over a dozen members of Manson's family lived at Dennis's mansion. Dennis Wilson even famously stated, quote, "I live with 17 girls." According to journalist Tom O'Neill, Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, and their friend Greg Jacobson all should have realized that Manson was likely behind the Tate-LaBianca murders for various reasons. For instance, Charles Manson had discussed his helter-skelter race war theory with them. He mentioned that affluent white people were going to be murdered and that at the scenes of the murders, the killers would use the victims' blood to write messages on the walls. Manson even predicted that some of the victims would be hanged. Well, in both the Tate and LaBianca murders, messages were written on the walls in the blood of their victims. And horrifyingly, when it came to Sharon Tate in particular, she was hanged. So how come neither Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, or Greg Jacobson were able to put two and two together? Why didn't they contact the police and mention that it was possibly Manson behind the murders? The murders took place in August of '69, but Manson wasn't arrested until November. The police didn't know where to start looking. As a matter of fact, initially, the police thought the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were unrelated. They suspected the LaBianca killings were a copycat murder, partly because of how similar the crime scenes were with the blood writing on the walls. Again, Manson had told Dennis, Terry, and Greg that these exact type of murders would happen. Did the three of them truly have no inclination at all that Manson was behind the Tate-LaBianca murders? Or maybe for some reason, Dennis, Terry, and Greg wanted to keep quiet, even though they could have helped the police arrest Manson sooner. This is something Tom O'Neill points out in his book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. I'm going to share with you a quote from that book where he discusses the highly sexual relationship Dennis Wilson had with the Manson family and Manson's relationship with record producer Terry Melcher. After breaking down the very close relationships Manson had with Melcher and with Dennis, Tom O'Neill asks a very poignant question. Why didn't they contact the police? Quote, "The story of Manson and Melcher starts with Dennis Wilson. By the summer of 1968, Wilson, then 23, had reached an impasse. He'd become world famous as the drummer for the Beach Boys, helmed by his brother Brian. Now the band was in a decline, edged out by more subversive acts. He and his wife, Carol, had recently divorced for the second time. She wrote in court filings that he had a violent temper, inflicting quote-unquote severe bodily injury on her during his rampages. The couple had 2 young children, but Dennis decided to live as a bachelor. He moved into a lavish Spanish-style mansion in the swanky Los Angeles area, Pacific Palisades. Dennis's new mansion boasted 31 rooms and a swimming pool in the shape of California. He redecorated in the spirit of the times, zebra print carpet, abundant bunk beds, and hosted decadent parties hoping to have as much sex as possible. One day, Wilson was driving his custom red Ferrari down the Pacific Coast Highway when 2 hitchhikers, Manson family members Ella Jo Bailey and Patricia Krenwinkel, caught his eye. He gave them a quick lift. When he saw them again soon afterwards, he picked them up a second time, taking them back to his place for milk and cookies. Whether they actually had cookies or whether those quote-unquote cookies were actually sex, whatever the case may be, the girls told Manson about the encounter. The girls weren't aware of Wilson's clout in the music industry, but Manson was, and he insisted on going back to the house with them. After a late-night recording session, Wilson returned to his estate to surprisingly find the Manson family bus parked outside. To his surprise, Dennis Wilson's living room was filled with topless girls. Whatever alarm Dennis may have felt initially was immediately put to ease when Charles Manson sunk to his knees and kissed Wilson's feet. This night ushered in a summer of ceaseless partying for Dennis Wilson. Charles Manson and his family set up shop in Dennis Wilson's house, and soon Manson recruited one of the group's deadliest members, Tex Watson, who picked him up hitchhiking. The Manson family spent their days smoking dope and listening to Charlie strum the guitar. The girls made the meals, did the laundry, and most importantly, slept with the men on command. Manson prescribed sex 7 times a day, before and after all 3 meals and once in the middle of the night. It was as if we were kings just because we were men, Tex Watson later wrote. Soon, Dennis Wilson was bragging so much that he landed a headline in Record Mirror, a now defunct British newspaper, stating, "I live with 17 girls." Talking to Rave magazine, Dennis Wilson offered disjointed remarks about his new friend, who he called the Wizard. "Sometimes the Wizard frightens me. The Wizard is Charles Manson, a friend of mine who thinks he is God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry, and he may be another artist for Brother Records. Brother Records being the Beach Boys record label. That last bit excited Manson, who was desperate to leverage his connection with Wilson into a music career. The two of them co-wrote a song titled Cease to Exist, whose lyrics claim that submission is a gift. Later that year, the Beach Boys recorded the song, but they changed the title, finessed the lyrics, and dropped Manson's songwriting credit, a snub that fueled his anger towards the establishment. Manson hung out with some of the biggest names in music. Neil Young remembered meeting Manson and the girls at Wilson's place. A lot of pretty well-known musicians around Los Angeles knew Manson, Young later said, though they'd probably deny it now. Among these was Terry Melcher. He and Wilson had pledged allegiance to the, quote, Golden Penetrators, a horny triumvirate they'd formed with their friend Greg Jacobson. The Penetrators, who'd painted a gold car to celebrate themselves, aimed to sleep with as many women as they could. Wilson's ex-wife referred to them as a quote-unquote roving coxman. Obviously, then, Terry Melcher would want to rove over to Wilson's house. It was full of promiscuous young women. Sometime in that summer of '68, at one of Wilson's marathon parties, he crossed paths with Manson for the first time. After another such party, Melcher rode back to Cielo Drive with Wilson, and Manson came along in the back seat. As Melcher later testified, Manson got a good look at the house from the driveway. When the end of the summer finally came, things went south with Wilson, who'd finally grown tired of footing the bill for the endless party. Upwards of $100,000 in food, clothes, and car repairs, plus gonorrhea treatments. According to Vincent Bugliosi, Manson's future prosecutor, Dennis Wilson was too frightened of Manson to throw him out. Instead, Dennis simply up and left in the middle of the night, leaving the messy business of eviction to his landlord. But it must have been more complicated than that. Wilson gave 3 interviews in which he raved about Manson and the girls, and all of those interviews date to the winter and summer of '69, which is nearly a year after he and the family had supposedly parted ways. Thus, why would Dennis Wilson brag about his connections to a man he'd just schemed to escape? The only sure fact is that Manson and his group decamped to Spahn Ranch in late August of '68. Wilson moved into a Malibu beach house with Greg Jacobson, who'd recently also split from his marriage. Having drifted from Dennis Wilson, his best shot at a record deal, Manson knew he had to hitch his wagon to Terry Melcher. As Manson's chances for fame dwindled, his mood darkened. He became obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, released in late November of 1968. Manson started to preach about the prophecies of a race war embedded in its lyrics. Things only got worse in early 1969, when Manson invited Melcher to come out and listen to his music. Manson prepared meticulously for the prospective meeting, but Melcher stood him up. On March 23, 1969, a desperate Charles Manson went searching for producer Terry Melcher. Manson thought he could goad the producer, he could urge him into a record deal. And thus, Manson found his way back to the house at Cielo Drive. He remembered Terry Melcher lived there. But instead of Melcher, Sharon Tate's personal photographer, Sharon Hatami, intercepted Manson. The photographer Hatami had never heard of Terry Melcher. He told Manson to go to the guest house and talk to the owner of the property, Rudolph Altobelli. Rudolph explained to Manson that Melcher no longer lived here. Manson prevailed on Greg Jacobson, who was still a friend and still a fan of his girls, to book another session with Melcher. This time, it worked. That May, Melcher made the winding drive to the Spahn Ranch and auditioned Manson in person, visiting twice over 4 days. Manson had rounded out a dozen or so of his best songs with backing singing from the girls. Performing in a gully in the woods, the girls sprawled on the ground and gazed up at their leader, who sat atop a rock with his guitar in hand. I wasn't too impressed by the songs, Melcher would later testify. I was impressed by the whole scene, by Charlie's strength and his obvious leadership. As a courtesy, the producer complimented Manson, saying that 1 or 2 of his songs were quote-unquote nice. Melcher had no intention of offering a recording contract, but he saw how the family's rustic, cultish lifestyle would lend itself to a TV documentary. Melcher suggested that his friend, Mike Deasy, whose van was outfitted to make field recordings, could come out to the ranch and capture another performance. Now, before Melcher could get out of there, a man at the ranch came stumbling out of a pickup truck. Drunk and belligerent, he was dressed like a cowboy, fingering a holstered gun, the same one that would later be used at the Tate murders. Manson stepped up to him and shouted, "Don't draw on me," socking him in the gut, taking his gun and continuing to pummel him. It spooked Melcher. Here was a peace and love cult with naked girls roaming the old Western sets, and yet the constant threat of violence loomed over the place. It was so bizarre it needed to be documented. And so a few days later, Melcher returned with Deasy and Jacobson, and the family repeated their audition. But what had seemed spontaneous now felt rehearsed. Deasy returned a few more times until he had a frightening LSD trip with Manson and vowed never to go back. It was all getting too toxic. Melcher conveyed his rejection of Manson through Jacobson, and that was the end of that. Manson's last brush with greatness was gone, and he became full-on apocalyptic. Terry Melcher never went back to the ranch or saw anyone from the family ever again. Or at least that's what he said under oath, anyway. After the murders, as Hollywood panicked and the LAPD chased down the leads, the Golden Penetrators realized that they hadn't yet quite washed their hands of Manson. This is where their story began to feel unbelievable to me. Manson wasn't charged with murder until late November, but Wilson, Jacobson, and Melcher had good cause to suspect him back in August, right after the killings. By then, they were frightened of Manson, but Helter Skelter does little to indicate their terror. When I saw how much they knew and how quiet they'd kept despite the fact their information would have helped the police solve the case, I realized just how flimsy the Helter Skelter motive was. Its unforgettable grandiosity may have hidden a more proastic truth, that a few rich guys had gotten in over their heads with an unstable ex-con. First of all, Wilson and Jacobson knew that Manson had shot a black man named Bernard Crowe about 5 weeks before the Tate murders, and Jacobson in particular, who testified that he'd talked to Manson upwards of 100 times, was well acquainted with his friend's bizarre race war predictions. Manson had warned Jacobson that the quote-unquote whiteys in affluent homes in Bel Air would be cut up and dismembered, and that the murderers would smear the victims' blood on the walls and hang them from the ceiling. And yet, when a group of affluent whites really was cut up and Sharon Tate was hung from the ceiling of her home, Jacobson apparently didn't make the connection. Nor did it occur to him in mid-August when he witnessed Manson's violence firsthand. Manson broke into Jacobson's home in the middle of the night, shook him awake, and produced a bullet. "Tell Dennis there are more where this came from," he said. On the witness stand, Jacobson compared Manson that night to a caged bobcat. The electricity was almost pouring out of him, his hair was on end, his eyes were wild. A few days earlier, Manson had shown up at Wilson's house too, demanding $1,500. When Wilson refused to give him the money, Manson threatened him. "Don't be surprised if you never see your kid again." After Manson's eventual arrest, Wilson fell into a deep depression, spurring his problems with drugs and alcohol. Later, he told Beach Boys authorized biographer David Leaf, "I know why Charles Manson did what he did. Someday, I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it." Unfortunately, he never got the chance. In 1983, 3 weeks after his 39th birthday, an acutely drunk Wilson dove from the deck of his boat into the chilly waters of the Marina del Rey. He accidentally drowned. Within days, a rock journalist wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle about a jarring exchange he'd had with Wilson. "Me and Charlie, we founded the family," Dennis had said, apropos of nothing. The Golden Penetrators had an abundance of reasons to accuse Manson of the Tate-LaBianca murders, immediately. They believed he'd shot someone dead, he threatened 2 of them with violence, and they knew he'd stockpiled guns and knives at the ranch. And the slaughter at Melcher's old house was exactly the kind Manson predicted, down to the most chilling detail. Shouldn't they have connected the dots, or was it possible that there was a conspiracy of silence among them? End quote. There are so many unanswered questions and loose ends that Tom O'Neill has uncovered about the official Manson murder narrative. What is true and what isn't? That's something people are still trying to figure out. Now, interestingly, in 2025, during the massive Los Angeles fires, the Pacific Palisades area was largely decimated. Yet, Dennis Wilson's former house, the Charles Manson crash pad in the Pacific Palisades, was essentially left untouched. Now, I don't think there's any sort of conspiracy as to why Dennis's former house survived the fires, but it's an interesting bit of trivia. I do believe that there is some very shady stuff in general about the LA fires, but that's a different topic. In any case, I want to read to you an article from The Hollywood Reporter by Lily Ford regarding the Dennis Wilson Manson family house surviving the LA fires. And following this article, I have more to share about the Wilson-Manson connection. Quote, The former home of the late Dennis Wilson, member of the Beach Boys and once a friend of the Manson family, is still standing after the Pacific Palisades fire. 14400 Sunset Boulevard, where in the late 60s, Wilson would regularly host cult leader Charles Manson and many of his female followers, was photographed seemingly unscathed by the wildfires which have torn across Southern California. Dennis Wilson was reportedly fascinated by Manson and his followers as the two of them struck up a friendship in 1968. Many women, all of them of the Manson family, were housed at the residence that summer and cost Dennis Wilson around $100,000, equivalent to $900,000 in 2025. In late 1968, Wilson told the Record Mirror magazine, "When I met Manson, I found he had great musical ideas. We're writing together now. He's dumb in some ways, but I accept his approach and have learned from him." He told reporters at the time that he had been living with 17 women. When asked if he was supporting them, Wilson replied, "No. If anything, they're supporting me. I had all the rich status symbols, Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, home after home. Then I woke up and gave away 50 to 60% of my money. Now I live in one small room with one candle, and I'm happy, finding myself." It was reportedly at Wilson's house parties where Manson was able to meet Hollywood celebrities. In the summer of 1968, Manson recorded several tracks at Brian Wilson's home studio, though the recordings remain unreleased to the public. The Beach Boys recorded one of Manson's songs, Cease to Exist, though they retitled it Never Learn Not to Love. It was released as the B-side of their single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain, in December of 1968, and Manson didn't get a credit, nor was he involved in the recording. Growing fearful of Manson, Wilson distanced himself from the family and moved out of the house around the same time. Following the 1969 murders, Wilson was reportedly threatened by the Manson family. Dennis did not testify against Charles Manson when Charles was later charged with numerous counts of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In the 1978 biography, The Beach Boys and the California Myth, Wilson acknowledged his relationship with Manson and said, "I know why he did what he did. Someday, I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it." In 1983, however, Wilson drowned at Marina del Rey. End quote. The following is from allthat'sinteresting.com by Katie Serena, regarding Dennis Wilson's relationship with Charles Manson. Quote, "Dennis Wilson didn't like to talk about it. In 1969, while the U.S. was thrown into a fraught state as Charles Manson was arrested for the Tate-LaBianca murders, Dennis Wilson was asked repeatedly to discuss his relationship with the madman. As the Manson family trials unfolded and the morbidly curious followed along, captivated by the charismatic leader of the now infamous cult, Dennis Wilson could hardly avoid the pressing questions about the time Manson spent in his house. For months, the case dominated the airwaves, and Dennis Wilson had to hear it all. It's not surprising Dennis Wilson didn't like to talk about it. Since their inception in 1961, the Beach Boys had managed to create an entirely new sound fusing jazz harmonies and laid-back California style. Their 1963 song, Surfin' USA, was a massive hit, and several other albums topped the charts. But in 1968, the year that the Manson family lived with Dennis Wilson, the band was on a downward trajectory. Their two albums from 1967, Smiley Smile and Wild Honey, were their worst-selling albums to date, and they both received a tepid reception from music critics. While the band had generated somewhat of a reputation as a wholesome family unit, 4 of its members were related by blood, several members struggled with substance abuse. Brian Wilson, the band's leader and main songwriter, began to withdraw and came to rely more heavily on cocaine, amphetamines, and psychedelics. The British invasion of the mid to late 1960s hurt the Beach Boys' album sales tremendously. The quote-unquote British invasion was when UK bands like the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who really broke through in America. During this slow period in the Beach Boys' history, one member, Dennis Wilson, when he played host to a smooth-talking yet unknown rock star he knew as Charlie. It seemed that Dennis Wilson, middle brother of bandmates Carl and Brian, had a habit of picking up more than good vibrations. In 1968, Wilson was driving his Rolls-Royce through Los Angeles when he picked up 2 hitchhiking women and dropped them off at their home. Sometime later, he picked up the same 2 women. This time, however, he brought them back to his place in the Pacific Palisades. The women began to tell him about the man they were staying with, a mystical musician named Charlie, who had been serving as their spiritual guru. Wilson, a self-destructive, fame-addled good boy gone bad on the heels of a nasty divorce, was immediately intrigued. Late that night, when Wilson arrived back home after a recording session, he was greeted at the door by none other than Charles Manson. Recognizing the fear on Wilson's face, Manson got down on his knees and kissed Wilson's feet. "Do I look like I'm gonna hurt you, brother?" Manson asked Wilson. According to the biography of former Manson family member Diane Lake, the two got along immediately. In her words, Dennis and Charlie hit it off right away, which is not surprising given Charlie's skills at ingratiating himself with strangers. Dennis, in no rush to leave, hung out for a while, smoked some pot with Charlie, and listened to a bit of Manson's music. It was obvious from the start that Dennis liked the girls and admired Charlie's harem. "We sat at Charlie's feet and looked at him lovingly as he sang and played guitar. We made sure Dennis saw how much we idolized Charlie. We knew that was our job, without Charlie even having to tell us." From then on, Wilson wanted to be part of Manson's world. He introduced him to his friends, to his family, and eventually to his Beach Boy bandmates. "This is Charlie," Wilson would say upon introduction. "He is the wizard, man. He is a gas." Over the next several months in the summer of 1968, Dennis Wilson spent innumerable hours with Charles Manson and his groupies, even going so far as to move them into his home. Within the confines of his secluded home, Wilson and the Manson family played music, dropped acid, and engaged in group sex. Wilson spent much of his own money keeping the family afloat, feeding them and bringing them to doctor's appointments when a gonorrhea outbreak hit. Unlike Dennis, however, the rest of the Beach Boys were not as keen on Charles Manson. Brian Wilson, the leader of the group and the oldest Wilson brother, took an immediate disliking to Charles and flat out refused to work with him. Charles, of course, was trying to break into the music industry. As summers came to a close, tensions came to a head. During a recording session, Manson found out that producers had altered his music and that the Wilson team was trying to make his sound fit with the Beach Boys. Things got tense and ended with Manson pulling a knife on a producer. That would be the last time Charles Manson and the Beach Boys got together in the studio. Following this knife-pulling incident, the rest of the band urged Dennis to cut ties with Charles Manson. He did, but before he did, Dennis made one last reckless move. In December of 1968, the group recorded Never Learn Not to Love on the B-side of their single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain. Little did people know that the song Never Learn Not to Love was originally known as Cease to Exist and was written by Charles Manson. The song title was changed, some of the lyrics were refined, and when the song was eventually released, the only writing credit was given to Dennis Wilson. Not long after the release of the song, Dennis Wilson awoke one day to find a bullet in his bed. Charles Manson would later take responsibility. In a now famous interview with journalist Diane Sawyer, Charles Manson said the following: "I gave Dennis Wilson a bullet, didn't I? I gave him a bullet because he changed the words to my song." End quote. Now, in general, why did Manson kill Sharon Tate? The killings at Cielo Drive on August 9, 1969 were not physically done by Manson, but the murders were done under his orders. So why did he order these killings, and specifically, why Sharon Tate? First, I'm going to tell you the mainstream narrative as to why these murders happened, and then I'm going to share with you what many people believe is the actual story. So, the mainstream narrative of the story is that Sharon Tate, along with the other victims, were not deliberately targeted, but rather they were collateral damage. The prevailing mainstream story as to why Manson targeted the house on Cielo Drive is because that's where record producer Terry Melcher was living. Charles Manson had a close relationship with Terry Melcher, and on various occasions, Manson and some of his followers actually spent time at the house on Cielo Drive. For his part, Terry Melcher had visited Spahn Ranch, the infamous hippie commune near Chatsworth, Los Angeles, where Manson and his followers were living. Terry was considering signing Manson to a record deal, but when the record deal never happened, Manson took his revenge by attacking Melcher's house. Therefore, according to this version of the story, it was irrelevant who was actually killed in Terry Melcher's home on Cielo Drive, because the point wasn't about targeting any one specific person, but rather killing anyone who happened to be in the house as a message to Terry. According to the mainstream narrative, Manson didn't even know Terry Melcher didn't live at the house anymore. During the Manson hearings the following year in 1970, Terry Melcher stated that after the murders, he had never met with Manson ever again. Now, as the years have gone by, more and more people have begun to challenge the mainstream story regarding the Manson murders. First and foremost, Manson was aware that Terry Melcher didn't live at that house on Cielo Drive anymore. The idea that Manson didn't know he wasn't there isn't true. Terry also said he never met Manson again after the murders. However, journalist Tom O'Neill was able to prove that Terry Melcher did in fact meet with Charles Manson not just once, but multiple times after the killings. Tom O'Neill's findings proved that Melcher did lie about this in court. As a matter of fact, Tom O'Neill has stated that he did approach Terry Melcher regarding his findings. According to Tom, Terry Melcher was livid that he was going to publish this information. Bottom line, given how much of the Manson story has been proven to be false, could it be that the Mansons did specifically target Sharon Tate? According to Tom and various others, the Manson family did actually plan to kill Sharon Tate and her friends at least on one other occasion. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojtek Frykowski were 4 of the victims killed on August 9, 1969 by the Manson family. Infamously, when the Manson family invaded the Sharon Tate house on August 9th, the first thing Manson follower Tex Watson did was cut the phone lines. Now, with that kept in mind, something eerily similar happened on another occasion. According to Tom O'Neill and various others, Sharon, Jay, Abigail, and Wojtek were hanging out at another house not long before August 9th. As the 4 friends were hanging out, the lights in that house started to act weird. It was later discovered that someone had cut power lines connected to that house. None of this is a conspiracy, by the way. This pre-August 9th incident 100% happened. But the question is, why and who? Who cut the power lines? The prevailing theory here is that the Manson family did intend on killing Sharon, Jay, Abigail, and Wojtek on this occasion, but they cut the wrong lines and bailed. That part hasn't been proven, but it's certainly a pretty big coincidence that something like this would happen to Sharon and her friends briefly before they were murdered in a disturbingly similar circumstance. The deeper you dig into the Manson story, the more you come across these weird coincidences. Tom O'Neill and others argue that this pre-August 9th incident does strongly suggest the Manson family was targeting Sharon Tate and her friends specifically. I personally agree with that. I do think Sharon Tate and her circle of friends were specifically targeted. But again, the question is why? There are many theories as to what the motive may have been to kill Sharon Tate, but up to this point, at least not publicly, there is no definitive answer as to why Sharon and her friends were specifically targeted. Some people believe Sharon Tate's husband, Roman Polanski, may have had a hand in this. Personally, I don't think he had anything to do with Sharon's murder, but to be clear, Polanski was a very abusive husband to Sharon Tate, and that's why some people think he may have been involved in the murder in some capacity. Regarding Polanski's abusive behavior, for instance, it's well documented that when Sharon Tate told Polanski she was pregnant, Polanski demanded she get an abortion. When Sharon didn't agree to have an abortion, Roman ditched Sharon in Los Angeles and flew out to London. In London, Roman had a very public affair with Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Michelle was a friend of Sharon's. Ditching your pregnant wife in another country and publicly cheating on your pregnant wife with her friend, that's not exactly a healthy relationship. Then, after the murders, police in Los Angeles found video of Polanski forcing Sharon Tate into having threesomes. As a matter of fact, Roman Polanski was known to show sex tapes of Sharon to his house guests. Polanski has a very disturbing sexual history. Most notably, of course, in 1977, Roman Polanski raped a 13-year-old girl in the U.S. That's why he permanently fled the United States for France in order to avoid the legal consequences. Bottom line, Polanski was both emotionally and sexually abusive towards Sharon Tate. According to the film, Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth, Sharon Tate was actually planning on divorcing Polanski. This film was made by Jay Sebring's nephew, Anthony DiMaria. In the film, an attorney says that he met with Sharon Tate regarding getting a divorce between her and Polanski. This same attorney felt certain that Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were still in love, which quite frankly would make sense. Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate stayed very close even after they broke up. It wouldn't have been hard to imagine they were still in love. Now, this divorce rumor has never been confirmed, but I do think it's likely true. Sharon wanted a traditional monogamous relationship, a marriage with Roman Polanski in the old-fashioned way. But Polanski still wanted to live a swinger lifestyle. On the 50th anniversary of Sharon Tate's death, August 9, 2019, the Washington Post wrote an article about Sharon. In that article, the Washington Post reported that apparently, if Polanski didn't change his behavior in the first 2 weeks after the baby was born, Sharon Tate intended to divorce him. I want to emphasize that this was reported by a major news outlet, the Washington Post. Now, obviously, major news outlets get things wrong all the time. However, I still think it's noteworthy that the Washington Post would publish an article in which they state Sharon Tate was strongly considering a divorce. The reason this is noteworthy to me is because in the mainstream narrative of Sharon Tate's life, there's no mention whatsoever that she was strongly considering divorcing Polanski. Again, these are the reasons some people think Polanski may have had a hand in the murders. As I said before, I personally don't think he was involved, but when reporting on a story, if you're trying to be honest in your reporting, it's important to showcase why people feel the way they do about certain things. Polanski's very abusive behavior towards Sharon Tate does condemn him in the eyes of many people who think he had a hand in the tragedy. Now, regarding the movie Jay Sebring's nephew made, I came across this following review. Quote, "In the film that Jay Sebring's nephew made about his uncle, an attorney stated that Sharon had him file divorce papers to end her marriage to Polanski. Unfortunately, Sharon was murdered before Polanski could be served with the documents. Polanski wanted Sharon to go to Brazil to have an abortion. She refused. At this point, Polanski verbally abused her, even in front of her friends. Then he cheated on her. After the murders, the LAPD found a video in the Cielo Drive house of Polanski, forcing Sharon into threesomes. While Jay Sebring was trying to save Sharon's life, Polanski was in London having yet another affair. Sharon, at least in the beginning, tolerated Polanski's infidelity. She loved him so much that she looked the other way. In the last months of Sharon's life, however, it bothered her immensely that he was being unfaithful to her. Of course, years after Sharon's death, Polanski infamously raped a 13-year-old girl in 1977. He fled to France to escape a prison sentence in the United States. About 15 years later, he raped a woman in France. Polanski has made it known that he likes young girls, and it's believed that he sexually assaulted other women in France as well." End quote. Now, going back specifically to the Manson murders, as mentioned, I do believe, based on the information uncovered by Tom O'Neill, that Sharon Tate and her friends were specifically targeted. But again, the question is why? If only Tex Watson, Manson's main assassin, was on record clarifying what had actually happened. Well, actually, he might be. Tom O'Neill discovered that there's about 20 hours of audio tape of Tex Watson discussing everything. However, due to multiple legal complications, those tapes have been kept locked away despite multiple efforts to get them released. Hopefully one day those tapes do surface and we get some more clarity as to why these murders happened. One hypothetical question that gets thrown around from time to time is, what if Sharon Tate was never killed? What if the Manson murders never happened? Well, spoiler alert, director Quentin Tarantino touched on this subject in his film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. At the end of that film, the would-be Manson murderers were the ones who got killed. Sharon Tate and her friends all survived, and that's where the film ends. As of this posting on August 9th, 2025, which is the 56th anniversary of the Sharon Tate murders, director David Fincher is in the process of making a sequel to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. This sequel will focus on Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character from the first film. David Fincher has directed Brad Pitt in 3 other major movies: Seven, Fight Club, and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. There are rumors that in this follow-up to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Margot Robbie may return in some capacity as Sharon Tate. Again, at this point, these are just rumors, but it would certainly be interesting to see how they would portray Sharon Tate in a timeline based after the Manson murders. If Sharon Tate had lived, would she have become a massive star? Would she have divorced Polanski and married Jay Sebring? There are so many what-ifs about the situation. And in the bigger picture of things, how would society be different if the Manson murders never happened? The murders sent shockwaves through society, and for many people, these killings destroyed the romantic image of the hippie movement. Hippies were supposed to be about peace and love, not murder. Well, according to a lot of people, that was actually the point. Many people believe that Manson was some sort of a CIA MKUltra asset, and that the plan was for him to orchestrate a series of horrific murders in order to turn public opinion against the hippie movement. Why? Because the hippies were against the war in Vietnam and many other key issues to the government. I'll be doing a deeper dive into that subject in another video. For now, however, I do want to touch on something I discussed in a previous video, which I found very interesting, especially since it's not a very well-known story. Apparently, Sharon Tate had a vision of her body mutilated years before the murder actually happened. Did Sharon have some sort of a premonition about the Manson murders? I'm going to share with you that story in a few minutes, but first, here's a quick clip of Charles Manson himself deflecting any responsibility for the Sharon Tate murder.
After you knew what that had happened at Sharon Tate, the most brutal murder that people were aware of. Not that there's not a lot of other brutality around, but this got attention. What'd you think?
Well, I looked over Vietnam and I said,
No, what'd you think about Sharon Tate and her unborn baby?
What did I think about it?
And, yeah.
It's not my world. I don't live in that world.
Well, so you didn't care?
Care?
Suppose
What the hell does that mean, care?
Well, it means love. That means some
Put
sense
me in solitary confinement, break my teeth out, break my ribs, bust me up, kick me down a hole,
Right.
and then come back and tell me about care. I don't know what care is, man.
Never once did Charles Manson ever express any remorse or regret for orchestrating the murder of Sharon Tate. As a matter of fact, he never expressed any remorse for any of the murders. It's very unfortunate that there are still some people out there who admire Charles Manson, but that's not going to be the topic of this video. Rather, in this video, I'm going to look at some of the aspects of Sharon Tate's life story. I'm going to show you a clip from Quentin Tarantino where he discusses Sharon Tate and why he wanted to make a movie about her. Then, at the end of this video, I'm going to read to you a segment from Tom O'Neill's groundbreaking book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, where he shares in intense detail what happened the nights of the Tate-LaBianca murders. But first, I want to share with you that story of Sharon Tate's vision. According to CieloDrive.com, on September 2nd, 1969, columnist Dick Kleiner wrote a very interesting piece about how apparently Sharon Tate told him in 1966, 3 years before her death, that she saw a vision of her body mutilated. Quote, "It was just a creepy story when Sharon Tate told it to me in early 1966. But now, 3 years and several murders later, it has acquired something much more than just creepiness. Sharon was a starlet in 1966. People thought she was going to be a big star, and maybe she would have been. She was sensational to look at, but there was something a little strange about her. Everybody noticed it. People thought at the time perhaps it was because her first feature film was an oddball terror thing called Eye of the Devil. But in any case, you could look at her for hours and listen to the nutty stories coming out of that beautiful head. I like stories of the supernatural, and Sharon knew that. She had a story like that to share with me. The story involved Jay Sebring and his house in Benedict Canyon. No, not the house where Sharon and Jay were killed in 1969. That house was on Cielo Drive, just off Benedict. But those two houses can't be much more than a mile apart. Anyways, Sharon used to date Jay Sebring. This was before she met Roman Polanski. Sharon and Jay were together for years, and Jay had a house in Benedict Canyon. This house was once owned by Paul Byrne, a director, writer, and producer for MGM. On September 5th, 1932, Paul Byrne commits suicide in this house. Sharon calmly told me this story. Now, at some point in Sharon's relationship with Jay Sebring, it seems that Jay was in New York on business, and Sharon was in between apartments. She called Jay and asked if she could stay in his house. Of course she could. That night at the house, that dark night, she was alone. Sharon wasn't usually spooked, but for some reason that night in the house, she was. She kept a light on by the side of her bed. Sharon told me, "I saw a creepy little man. He looked like the pictures I'd seen of Paul Byrne." Sharon ran downstairs. When she got downstairs, she wished she was still upstairs. "I saw a vision of someone tied to the staircase," she said. "It might have been me. It might have been Jay, but whoever it was, this body was cut open at the throat." Sharon needed a drink to calm her nerves. She eventually found the house bar, and there was some wallpaper by that bar. For some reason, Sharon picked away at the wallpaper and tore it down. Strange how the mind works. Worrying about wallpaper when ghosts are wandering around upstairs and mutilated bodies are tied to the staircase downstairs. Sharon thought it must have been a dream. She decided to find out and went back upstairs. According to Sharon, the mutilated body was still tied to the stairs. Could it have been her body or Jay's body? And that creepy little man was still prowling around upstairs. But Sharon went back to bed and somehow slept. When Jay Sebring came back the next morning, he woke her up. She remembered the events of the night before, but it must have been a dream. However, according to Sharon, Jay called out, "Hey, who tore the wallpaper off by the bar down here?" That part, at least, was not a dream. 3 years later, a mile up the road, there was a nightmare. Sharon, Jay, and 3 others, 4 if you include Sharon's unborn child, were all killed. End quote. Now, let's take a look at the fuller picture of Sharon Tate's life story. The following is from an article by Elena Nicolaou for Refinery 29. Quote, Sharon Tate was born in Dallas, Texas in 1943. Growing up, she won various beauty pageants in the U.S., but Sharon spent her high school years in Italy. Her father, a member of the U.S. Army, was transferred to an army base in Vicenza, a city in northern Italy. At the end of high school, Sharon was crowned prom queen. Eventually, she began to audition for the American films being shot in Italy. Her beauty was quickly noticed. For instance, one of the productions she appeared in was the movie Barabbas. The director of that movie, Richard Fleischer, wrote the following about Sharon in his autobiography. I pointed Sharon out to my assistant and told her that I wanted Sharon in every close shot I could possibly use her in. After getting a taste of Hollywood, being a prom and pageant queen wouldn't cut it anymore for Sharon Tate. Her father happened to receive a military transfer to Los Angeles, so in 1962, Sharon moved to LA. Soon, she was brought to the attention of Beverly Hillbillies producer Martin Ranselhoff, who said to Sharon, "Baby, we're going to make you a star." At the age of 20, Tate signed a 7-year contract with MGM and was literally groomed for stardom. For 3 years, she was on a rigorous circuit of acting, voice, singing, and bodybuilding classes. One of the last vestiges of the star system, Sharon didn't have control over her day-to-day schedule or her career direction. She briefly appeared in the movie Sandpiper starring Elizabeth Taylor, and allegedly, a jealous Elizabeth Taylor requested that Sharon Tate's scenes be deleted. In 1967, MGM deemed Tate ready for stardom. She was starring in 3 films, including a documentary featurette called All Eyes on Sharon Tate. Playboy magazine even declared 1967 as the year Sharon Tate happens. What finally shot Sharon to stardom was the 1967 movie Valley of the Dolls. Now, Sharon Tate's love life, unfortunately, is tied with her death. In 1964, Sharon began dating Jay Sebring, Hollywood's first celebrity hairstylist. They were together for 3 years. Tate even learned how to cut hair in Sebring's salon, which A-listers like Paul Newman, Warren Beatty, and Steve McQueen frequently visited. The couple got engaged but never made it to the church altar. Sharon began dating director Roman Polanski. She had been cast in his film The Fearless Vampire Killers, and they fell in love on set. The two got married on January 20th, 1968 in London, England. Their marriage was scrutinized by both tabloids and their inner circle. Polanski was a very controlling husband. At parties, Polanski would even screen sex videos he made with Sharon for his guests. Furthermore, Polanski wasn't happy when he found out Sharon was pregnant. When Sharon refused to have an abortion, Roman Polanski began to have affairs with other people, like Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Now, going back to Sharon's other significant romantic partner, Jay Sebring. Despite their relationship having ended, Jay and Sharon remained close friends. He was with her the night of her death and was also murdered by the Manson family on August 9, 1969. A few weeks before the murder, Sharon was in London with Polanski. On July 20th, a heavily pregnant Sharon Tate left London and returned to the house in Los Angeles she shared with Roman Polanski, 150 Cielo Drive. At the time, coffee heiress Abigail Folger and her boyfriend Wojtek Frykowski were also staying at the house along with Jay Sebring, who planned to stay with Sharon until she gave birth. Polanski planned to leave London on August 12th in time for the birth, but of course, by the time he returned, it was too late. Early morning on August 9th, 1969, Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times. Folger, Frykowski, Sebring, and a teenager named Stephen Parent were also killed by members of the Manson family. Sharon Tate's unborn child, named Paul Richard Polanski, died 20 minutes after his mother stopped breathing. The following night, Leo and Rosemary LaBianca were killed in their home. Unfortunately, Tate's gruesome death tends to overshadow her life's work. After Valley of the Dolls, she only starred in 2 more movies, The Wrecking Crew and 12+1. But Sharon has been portrayed in various films over the years, most famously by Margot Robbie in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Sharon Tate was more than just a murder victim. A friend of Sharon's once said the following about her. Sharon was a luminous beauty, kind, gentle, and a wonderful friend to all who were privileged to know her. End quote. Now, interestingly, in terms of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I came across an interview of Quentin Tarantino discussing why he wanted to touch on Sharon Tate's story. This is a clip from that interview with SiriusXM.
I first became aware of Sharon Tate in 1969, before the murders, because my parents took me to see The Wrecking Crew. And I had an immediate crush on her because, one, she was really pretty, and she's like, she plays like a clumsy klutz in the movie, so she was really funny. And she brought the house down. I really remember that screening. I mean, all the gags she did just floored the audience. And so naturally, you're a little boy, and you see this pretty girl, and she's doing pratfalls and being like Jerry Lewis or something. It was like, oh, wow, you have an instant crush on her. I mean, she was lovely. I didn't know that she was murdered, like, for a long, long time. The murders happened, but then it wasn't a year later until they captured the Manson family. And so I remember I was hearing the name Manson, and I asked my stepfather, I go, who is this Manson guy? And he goes, oh, quite, you don't need to worry about that. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about it. And so it wasn't until like a little later that I got older and understood the whole mythology of the Manson family. Why I felt the need to kind of tell Sharon's story to some degree is, well, everything I've read about her, I mean, she almost sounds too good to be true. She sounds just like a really nifty person. And like somebody, you would be pleased, it would be wonderful to know. And it seems like a real loss that she was, I mean, it's always a loss when somebody gets murdered, but it really seems like there is it really seems like the world is a lesser place because she wasn't allowed to live her life. And there was also this aspect of, I think it's horrible that she's been defined by her murder. And one of the things I can say about the film that I'm absolutely proud of is because of the movie, I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. I don't think she's just defined by her victim status as a murderer. Now people, I think they became they were very intrigued by Margot Robbie's performance in it, and I think they looked her up. So she just, she's not just a murder victim. And I think now, if you go back, because, every 4 years or so, they, 2020 does a big Manson special, or they do some big special on the Manson family. Now, after, like, getting a sense of her from the movie, if you watch those specials, they're really heartbreaking because she means something to you now, as opposed to just a statistic.
I'm going to read to you now a quote from Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, where he discusses in gruesome detail the Tate-LaBianca murders. Tom O'Neill did a fantastic job with this book, and I definitely recommend getting a copy if you want to learn the true story about what happened. Quote, August 8th, 1969. Late that night at the Spahn movie ranch near Chatsworth, Los Angeles, a man and 3 women got in a beat-up yellow 1959 Ford and headed towards Beverly Hills. A ranch hand heard one of the women say, "We're going to get some pigs." That woman was Susan Sadie Atkins, 21, who'd grown up mostly in San Jose. The daughter of 2 alcoholics, she said that her brother and his friends would often molest her. She had dropped out of high school and moved to San Francisco, where she'd worked as a topless dancer and gotten into LSD. My family kept telling me, "You're going downhill," she would later say. So I just went downhill all the way to the bottom. Huddled beside her in the back of the car was Patricia Krenwinkel. 21, from Inglewood, Krenwinkel had developed a hormone problem as a kid, leading her to overeat and fear that she was ugly and unwanted. As a teen, she got into drugs and started to drink heavily. One day in 1967, she left her car in a parking lot, failed to collect the 2 paychecks from her job at an insurance company, and disappeared. In the passenger seat was Linda Kasabian, 20, from New Hampshire. She played basketball in high school, but she dropped out to get married. The union lasted less than 6 months. Not long after, in Boston, she was arrested in a narcotics bust. By the spring of 1968, she'd remarried, had a kid, and moved to Los Angeles. Sometimes she'd introduce herself as Yana the Witch. At the wheel was Charles Tex Watson, 23 and 6'3" from East Texas. Watson had been a Boy Scout and the captain of his high school football team. He'd sometimes help his dad, who ran a gas station and grocery store. At North Texas State University, he joined a fraternity and started getting stoned. Soon, he dropped out, moved to California, and got a job as a wig salesman. One day, he picked up a hitchhiker who turned out to be Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, a chance occurrence that changed both their lives forever. That night in August of 1969, in the yellow Ford, Tex, Susan, Patricia, and Linda were all dressed in black from head to toe. None of them had a history of violence. They were part of a hippie commune that called itself the Family and lived in isolation at the abandoned Spahn Ranch. More than anything, the family lived in accordance to the whims of their leader, the 34-year-old Charles Manson, who had commanded the four of them to take their trip that night in August. The four arrived at 150 Cielo Drive, where the actress Sharon Tate lived with her husband, the filmmaker Roman Polanski. Polanski was away in London at the time, scouting locations for The Day of the Dolphin, a movie in which a dolphin is trained to assassinate the President of the United States. The drive to Cielo would have taken about 40 minutes. It was just after midnight when they arrived. It was quiet there, seemingly worlds away from the hustle and sprawl of Los Angeles. The Tate House, built in 1942, had belonged to a French actress who'd modeled it on the Norman country estates of her youth. This beautiful house sat on 3 acres of isolated land nestled against a hillside. From this house, you could see views of Los Angeles glittering to the east and Bel Air's Folsom Estates unfurling to the west. On a clear day, you could see straight to the Pacific 10 miles out. Anyways, Tex Watson scaled a pole to sever the phone lines to the house. Tex had been here before, and he knew where to find them right away. There was an electric gate leading to the driveway, but instead of activating it, the four elected to jump over an embankment and drop onto the main property. All of them were carrying buck knives. Watson also had a .22 buntline revolver. Kasabian remained on the outskirts, keeping watch. The other 3 crept up the hill toward the secluded estate. At the top of the driveway, they found Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was there visiting the caretaker in the guest house to sell him a clock radio. He was sitting in his dad's white car, having already rolled his window down to activate the gate control. Tex approached the driver's side of the car and pointed his gun at Stephen's face. "Please don't hurt me. I won't say anything," Stephen screamed, raising his arm to protect himself. Tex slashed his left hand with the knife, slicing through the strap of his wristwatch. Then he shot Parent 4 times. In his arm, his left cheek, and twice in the chest. Parent died instantly, his blood beginning to pool in the car. Those 4 shots rang out through the air, but no one in the house at 150 Cielo seemed to hear them. It was a rustic home of stone and wood. Finding no open windows or doors, Tex cut a long horizontal slit in a window screen outside the dining room and gained entry into the house. He went to the front door to let Atkins and Krenwinkel in. In the living room, the 3 killers came across Wojtek Frykowski, a 32-year-old Polish immigrant and an aspiring filmmaker, asleep on the couch with an American flag draped over it. Rubbing his eyes to make out the figures clad in black and standing over him, Wojtek stretched his arms and, apparently mistaking the Manson family for friends, asked them, "What time is it?" Tex aimed his gun at Wojtek and said, "Be quiet, don't move, or you're dead." Wojtek stiffened, the gravity of the situation beginning to seize him. "Who are you?" he asked, "and what are you doing here?" "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business," Tex replied, kicking Wojtek in the head. Susan Atkins then found a towel and used it to bind Wojtek's hands as best as she could. Then, on Tex's instructions, she looked through the house, searching for others. She came to a bedroom where she saw a woman reclining on a bed, reading. Abigail Folger, 25, the heiress to a coffee fortune. She'd been staying at the house with Wojtek, who was her boyfriend since April. Now, she glanced up from her book, smiled, and waved at Atkins, not realizing the danger. For her part, Atkins responded in kind and continued down the hall. Crazy. Atkins peered into a second bedroom, where a man sat on the edge of a bed talking to a pregnant woman who lay there in lingerie. The man, Jay Sebring, 35, was a hairstylist. His shop in Beverly Hills attracted a wealthy, famous clientele. He'd been the first one to cut hair in a private room as opposed to a barber shop. He'd served in the Navy during the Korean War. An intensely secretive man, he was rumored to allow only 5 people to keep his phone number. On the bed with him was his ex-girlfriend, Sharon Tate, then 26 and 8.5 months pregnant with her first child. She'd recently filmed her biggest role to date in 13 Chairs, and her manager had promised she'd be a star someday. Born in Dallas, Texas, Tate was the daughter of an Army officer. She grew up in cities scattered across the globe. Her beauty was such that she'd apparently stopped traffic, literally, on her first visit to New York. She'd been a homecoming queen and a prom queen. Even at 6 months old, she'd won a Miss Tiny Tot contest in Texas. A film career, she hoped, would get her noticed for something beyond her good looks. There, on Cielo Drive, at the home she called the Love House, Tate was optimistic about her future. She believed her child would strengthen her marriage with Polanski, who sometimes demeaned her. Now, having reported back to Tex, Susan retied Wojtek's hands with a piece of nylon rope. She went to bring the others into the living room, returning with Folger at knife point, and then with Sebring and Tate. "Come with me," she told them. "Don't say a word, or you're dead." In their shock and confusion, they offered the intruders money and whatever else they wanted, begging them not to hurt anyone. Tex ordered the 3 who'd come from their bedrooms to lie face down on their stomachs in front of the fireplace. Sharon Tate began to cry. Tex told her to shut up. Taking a long rope, he tied Sebring's hands behind his back and ran a length around his neck. He looped the rope around Tate's neck next and then Folger's, throwing the rest of it over a beam in the ceiling. Sebring struggled to his feet and protested. Couldn't this man see that Tate was pregnant? He tried to move towards Sharon, and Tex shot him, puncturing a lug. Sebring crumbled onto the zebra skin rug by the fireplace. Since they were all tied together, his collapse forced the screaming Tate and Folger to stand on their toes, to keep them from being strangled. Tex dropped to his knees and began stabbing the hairstylist incessantly. Standing up again, he kicked Sebring in the head. Then he told Krenwinkel to turn off all the lights. "What are you going to do to us?" Sharon Tate asked. "You're all going to die," Tex said. Wojtek had managed to free his hands. He lunged towards Atkins, attempting to disarm her. But she forced her knife into his legs, stabbing him constantly as they rolled across the living room floor, a tangle of limbs glinting with steel. He pulled her long hair, his blood spraying everywhere, and he'd been stabbed more than 6 times. But Wojtek staggered to his feet. Atkins had lost her knife, so he made a run for the front door, and with Atkins still pummeling him, got as far as the lawn. Tex shot him with 2 bullets and then tackled him to the ground, pounding the butt of his gun against the back of his head again and again. He hit him with such force that Wojtek's skull cracked. Inside, Sharon was sobbing. Then Folger, who lifted the noose from her neck, ran down the hall and out the house through a side door. She was halfway across the front lawn when Krenwinkel caught up to her and brought her knife down, stabbing her 28 times. Tex joined in and Folger went limp, saying, "I give up. I'm already dead." Drenched in blood and their own sweat, the 2 killers rose to see Wojtek yet again on his feet stumbling towards them. Soon, they were stabbing him with the same mechanical precision, forcing steel through flesh, bone, and cartilage. The coroner tallied 51 stab wounds to Wojtek, plus 13 blows to the head and 2 bullet wounds. Atkins had remained in the house with Sharon, who was whimpering, sitting on the floor, still only in lingerie and bound by the neck to the dead body of her former lover, Jay Sebring. She was the only one still alive. She was due to give birth to the child, a boy, in 2 weeks. Tex came back inside and ordered Atkins to kill her. Tate begged her to spare her life, to spare her unborn child. "I want to have my baby," she said. "Woman, I have no mercy for you," Atkins responded, locking her arm around Tate's neck from behind. "You're going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." She stabbed her in the stomach. Tex joined in, and the pair stabbed her 16 times until she cried out for her mother and died. Atkins dipped her fingers into one of Tate's wounds and tasted her blood. It was, quote, "warm, sticky, and nice," she'd later recall. "To taste death and yet give life," she said. Wow, what a trick. She soaked a towel in Tate's blood and brought it to the front door, where, following Tex's instruction to write something that would shock the world, she scrawled the word pig. Their work was done. When Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel and Kasabian returned to the Spahn ranch early that morning, they went to their beds and slept soundly. I was gone, Atkins later recalled. It was like I was dead. I could not think about anything. It was almost as if I passed out, blacked out. My head was blank. There was nothing in me. It was like I had given it all. At 150 Cielo Drive was a scene of such callous, barbarous devastation that it shook something loose in the national psyche. August 8th and August 9th suddenly seemed to describe different realities. Media accounts were quick to infer something more sordid than ordinary homicide, something occult had occurred. One paper called the murders a, quote, bloody orgy. Others reported ritualistic slayings and overtones of a weird religious rite. The facts were unavailable or misreported. Maybe drugs were involved. Maybe they weren't. Maybe Sebring had been wearing a black hood of a Satanist. Maybe he hadn't. The big picture was one of supernatural ruin. An officer at the scene said the bodies looked like mannequins dipped in red paint. Another said, it's like a battlefield up there. Pools of blood had soaked into the carpets. According to Time magazine, stray bullets were lodged in the ceiling. In Roman Polanski, whose films were errantly, even proudly occultist, the public found someone onto whom it could project its fatalism. A popular press account said that mere minutes before he learned of the murders, Polanski, at a party in London, had been discussing a friend's death. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, he said. Who will be the next to go? With that, the phone rang, and he was summoned to hear that his wife and friends had been brutally murdered. But it wasn't over. The next night, at the Spahn Ranch, the same group convened with 3 additions. There was 18-year-old Stephen Grogan, a musician and high school dropout, and the 19-year-old Leslie Van Houten, a former homecoming princess from the suburbs of Los Angeles. And then there was Charles Manson, their leader. The 7 of them piled into the beat-up Ford on a search for more victims. After nearly 3 hours of restive driving through Los Angeles and its environs, Manson finally settled on a home in Los Feliz, at 3301 Waverly Drive, next door to a house he'd once stayed in. Manson broke into the house by himself, armed with a pistol and a knife. Others maintained that he brought Tex Watson with him. In any case, he spotted Tate-LaBianca, 44 years old, a grocery store owner, asleep on the couch. Leno's wife, Rosemary, 38 years old, was in the bedroom. Rosemary was paranoid that people had been breaking in and moving their furniture around lately, and, like the whole city, she was spooked by the Tate murders the previous night. Even so, Manson was apparently able to walk right in through an unlocked door, and he tied up the couple by himself. Then, Manson rejoined his followers at the bottom of the long driveway, where they were waiting in the car. Manson chose Tex and Krenwinkel again as his executioners. This time he added Van Houten to the mix too. She'd never so much as struck a person before that night. Regardless, he told the 3 of them to go inside and kill everyone. They had only buck knives. They burst into the house, separated the couple, and stabbed Leno 26 times. They carved the word war into his stomach and impaled a carving fork beside it, its handle jutting out of his belly. And they left a steak knife protruding from his neck. Rosemary suffered 41 stab wounds, many inflicted after she'd already died. Before they left, the killer scrawled Helter Skelter in blood on the refrigerator, a reference to the Beatles song Helter Skelter, though they misspelt it. On the walls, they smeared Rise and Death to Pigs in Leno's blood. The blood shed in its primitive defiance, a pregnant star slaughtered, a man punctured with kitchen utensils, confirmed a sense of rupture in America. The 60s subversive spirit had come on with too much fervor. Some reckoning was bound to happen, or so it seemed in retrospect. The nation was immured in these events, in the motive, the manhunt, and then in 1970, the sensational 9.5-month-long trial. But after the murders, Manson and his followers were not brought to justice for nearly 4 months. With the suspects unknown and at large, rumors proliferated and the tension reached a fever pitch. For a while, the police maintained that the 2 sets of murders, the LaBianca Tate murders, were unrelated. They claimed the LaBiancas were the victims of a copycat attack. As days turned into weeks and weeks to months, 2 separate teams of LAPD detectives, one assigned to Tate, the other to the LaBiancas, failed to share information, believing that the crimes were unconnected. As they lost valuable time pursuing false leads, doubt and ridicule followed them in the press. For almost 4 months, the police would say that they had no real idea who had committed the murders, some of the most appalling murders in the history of the country. As journalist Joan Didion famously stated, the 60s abruptly ended on August 9, 1969. The tension broke that day. The paranoia was fulfilled. There's a germ of truth in what she said, but the process wasn't so abrupt. It began that day, but it wasn't over really until December 1st, 1969, the day the police announced the crimes had been solved and the nation got its first glimpse of the killers. Here was the final fulfillment of that paranoia, the last gasp of 60s idealism. At LAPD headquarters, the chief of police, Edward M. Davis, stepped up to an array of 15 microphones and announced to a stunned crowd of 200 reporters that the case was solved. Warrants were out for Charles Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. More people would be named pending grand jury indictments. Davis added, to everyone's astonishment, that the Tate-LaBianca murders were connected. The suspects may have been responsible for a series of other unresolved homicides, too. Police Chief Davis didn't name Manson or Susan Atkins that day because they were already in custody. In mid-October, Manson, with a welter of his followers, had been apprehended on auto theft charges at the Barker Ranch, a hideaway in the forbidding Death Valley, several hours away from Los Angeles. Its seclusion surpassed even that of the Spahn Ranch. Atkins had been charged with another unrelated murder, that of Gary Hinman, an old friend of Manson. She was being held at the Sybil Brand Institute, a jail for women in Los Angeles County, where she bragged to cellmates about her complicity in the Tate murders. Those offhand remarks broke the case open for the LAPD, who began to connect the dots they'd been staring at for nearly 4 months. Journalists dug into the story. Images of Manson and the family were emblazoned on front pages and TV screens around the world. The cognitive dissonance was intense. These weren't the faces of hardened criminals or escaped lunatics. They were hippies, stereotypical flower children. In the bloom of wide-eyed youth, the men unshaven and long-haired, wearing beads and buckskin jackets. The women in blue jeans and tie-dyed tops, no bras, and their hair tangled and unwashed. They talk like hippies, too, spouting an ethos of free love, eschewing monogamy and marriage in favor of sexual experimentation. They lived in roaming communes, caravanning along the Golden Coast in Technicolor bright buses and clunkers cobbled together from spare parts. They believed that hallucinations strengthened the spirit and expanded the mind. They gave birth naturally and raised their children together in rustic simplicity. In other ways, though, their philosophy was Gnostic, verging on theological. Time did not exist, they proclaimed. There was no good, no bad, and no death. All human beings were God and the devil at the same time and part of one another. The family's moral code, insofar as it existed at all, was riven with contradictions. While it was wrong to kill animals, according to their philosophy, even the snakes and spiders in their bunkhouses had to be carefully spared. It was fine to kill people, because, according to them, human life was inherently valueless. To kill a person was tantamount to, quote, breaking off a minute piece of some cosmic cookie, as Tex Watson later put it. If anything, according to their philosophy, death was something to be embraced, because it exposed your soul to the oneness of the universe. Where had these beliefs come from? The murderers had been raised and educated for the most part in solid conventional American communities. So what happened? The promise of the hippie movement had been in its willingness to forego cherished institutions in favor of the new and untested. The Manson family, with its starry-eyed communalism, sexual frankness, and veneration of LSD, offered a screen onto which anyone could project his insecurities about the era's politics and pressures. After the Tate murders, it seemed that hippies and freaks were more than a risible sideshow. They could really undermine the status quo. Their promiscuity had always earned a lot of finger-wagging from concerned moralists, while others had looked on with thinly veiled envy. Parents were worried about their kids that they would drop out, become hippies, and never get decent jobs. Everywhere, kids were hitchhiking. The consensus from the quote-unquote straight world was that hippies were mostly harmless, but you didn't want to be one. While there had been isolated incidents of violence attributed to hippies, none of it was as horrific, premeditated, or systematic as the murders committed by the Manson family. On December 12th, a piece in Time magazine drew parallels between hippies and violence. In the movement's Invitation to Freedom, the magazine warned, criminals and psychotics blossomed as easily as innocents and pacifists did. But how, Time asked, could children who had dropped out for the sake of kindness and caring, love and beauty, end up killing? End quote. This is one of the main arguments that the author Tom O'Neill is making with this book. I'm not really giving anything away here because he's done several interviews about this, where he discusses that his theory is that what happened with the Mansons wasn't some sort of random act, but rather Manson was a CIA asset and that these murders were meant to put a massive stain on the hippie movement because the government considered the hippie movement a threat in many regards. I'm paraphrasing here essentially, I'm oversimplifying it, but basically this is one of the main arguments Tom O'Neill makes. One theory a lot of people have is that Manson was some sort of a CIA asset, and that in general, much of the popular music coming out of Los Angeles in the 60s was a government psyop. It might sound completely crazy at first, but the more you dig into it, the more and more it makes sense, at least to an extent. Some people believe, for instance, that Jim Morrison, one of the most prominent figures of 1960s Los Angeles, was also some sort of a CIA plant or something like that. Interestingly, as I've mentioned in a previous video, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the Manson murders. Why? I don't think Jim had anything to do whatsoever with the Manson killings, but Jim did know Manson personally. Perhaps somehow the police got wind of this. That is a subject I'm still researching. I'd really like to know why the police questioned Jim. Now, for those of you who may be surprised that Jim and Manson knew each other, it's true. Even Jim Morrison's Doors bandmate Ray Manzarek has stated that Jim and Manson knew each other. The question is, did they know each other well, or were they not too familiar with each other? What exactly was the nature of Jim and Manson's relationship? I am making a separate video about the overlooked connection between Jim and Manson. I will post a link to that video in the description box here once it's ready. In any case, as mentioned, lots of people believe Manson was part of a government psyop, and that many prominent figures of the 60s music scene from Los Angeles, including Jim Morrison, were also a psyop. The Jim Morrison example is particularly interesting to me, not just because the police questioned Jim about the Manson murders, but also because President Nixon and the FBI kept a close eye on Jim. Nixon and the FBI considered Jim Morrison dangerous. They considered him subversive. As one of the leading figures of the hippie movement of the anti-Vietnam War movement, Jim Morrison was not somebody that the government looked upon nicely. The Miami incident gave them the public cover they needed to finally go after Jim very aggressively. I've discussed the Miami incident previously, but for those of you who may not be familiar with it, on March 1st, 1969, during a Doors concert in Miami, Jim Morrison allegedly pulled out his private in front of a packed house. To this day, there is no definitive evidence to prove or disprove that Jim did that. But regardless of the lack of evidence, this alleged incident led to a massive public controversy which the FBI and President Nixon used to their advantage against Jim. The first thing I want to do here is read to you a quote from Jim Morrison Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis, where he breaks down how the FBI and President Nixon went after Jim. Quote, "The FBI files, the dossier concerning Jim Morrison, contains a report on the infamous Miami show from March 1st, 1969, where Jim allegedly pulled out his private. The name of the FBI informant is blacked out. The informant declared that Jim exposed himself. According to the file, the informant advised that he is conducting an investigation and warrants will be obtained for Jim Morrison's arrest on misdemeanor charges. The matter will be discussed with the Florida State Attorney's Office to determine if Jim Morrison can be charged with a felony." Now, on March 5th, 1969, a few days after the concert, Larry Mahoney, a young reporter for the Miami Herald, reported that the Miami police had issued an arrest warrant for Jim, charging indecent exposure and disorderly conduct by profanity. Jim Morrison was in big trouble, much bigger than anyone realized. Officials at both the FBI and the Nixon White House believe that Jim Morrison had previously made threats against President Nixon. Whether or not Jim actually threatened or was a threat to Nixon was irrelevant. This Miami case presented the authorities the perfect opportunity to finally shut Jim up. The FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation was currently neutralizing, sometimes violently, the government's critics and perceived enemies. They were, for instance, already harassing John Lennon, who had made outraged statements against Nixon's policies. The details that can be gleaned over from Jim Morrison's censored FBI file, plus the prosecution and subsequent police threats against Jim, seem to indicate that no less than the director of the FBI himself, J. Edgar Hoover, may have had a hand in the persecution of Jim Morrison. President Nixon himself sent a letter of support to a quote-unquote rally for decency held at the Orange Bowl in Miami on March 23, 1969, to protest the behavior of Jim Morrison. Meanwhile, the Doors' lucrative tour was suddenly canceled. The Concert Hall's Management Association put out the word that the Doors were poison. Their insurance company canceled their policies. Big money dates in Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Toronto, Detroit, Boston, etc., were immediately spiked. Suddenly, almost mysteriously, the Doors dropped off the radio, as if they've been banned from airplay. And this wasn't just in March. For instance, scheduled summer shows in Seattle and Hawaii were also canceled. Rumors circulated that local FBI offices were warning promoters to stay away from the Doors. Letters concerning the quote-unquote filth the Doors were peddling continued to find their way to J. Edgar Hoover and were subsequently filed in the Doors' FBI dossier. The following year, in August of 1970, Jim Morrison was back in Florida for trial proceedings. It seemed obvious to various observers that Jim Morrison was being railroaded to prison under the watchful eye of the Nixon administration. Somebody was out to break the Doors financially and physically. No one in the media was going to stand up for Jim in his hour of need. On October 14, 1970, Jim taped an interview with the rock magazine Circus. During this interview, Jim said he was facing prison time and that he was worried about it. In Jim's own words, he called the Miami trial more a political than a sexual scandal. Jim Morrison's first rub-in with the FBI, however, wasn't the Miami trial of '69. It goes back at least a year earlier to 1968. February 1968. One morning, America woke up, turned on breakfast television, and watched in awe as a barefoot peasant militia battered American troops and took over the major cities of South Vietnam. This was the fabled Tet, Lunar New Year offensive, when the Viet Cong almost overran the South Vietnamese army and their American allies. South Vietnam was saved only after bloody pitched battles. Famous quote, "We had to destroy the village in order to save it." From that moment on, the great mass of Americans knew the Vietnam conflict was lost. The war dragged on for 7 more years at enormous and disgraceful costs to American lives. The Doors, to their credit, did their best to stop the carnage. They had been performing The Unknown Soldier, their acute and furious protest song, for the past several months. Their Soldier promo clip, meant to be broadcast but immediately banned for its violence and amateurish production values, was shown at Doors concerts beginning the following month. The audiences were stunned, and a few even realized they had seen one of the most intense anti-war statements that Americans had ever committed to film. It was around then, according to the heavily censored Federal Bureau of Investigation files on the Doors, that a group of radio executives in the South sent letters to the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover suggesting that the Doors were disseminating enemy propaganda and damaging civilian morale with their obscene performances and anti-war messages. End quote. Now, some people believe that Jim Morrison may have also been a CIA asset. I covered this in my previous video about Jim and Manson, but for those of you who haven't seen it, here's a quick recap. Jim's father, George, was an important figure in the U.S. Navy, so much so that George Morrison was directly involved in the famous incident, which led to increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. Navy and the North Vietnamese Navy exchanged fire. George Morrison, Jim's dad, was in command of American forces during this confrontation. 4 North Vietnamese were killed and 6 more were wounded. On the American side, there were no casualties, but regardless, this incident, now known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, famously gave the Johnson administration the quote-unquote justification they needed to escalate U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Some people find it too much of a coincidence that Jim Morrison, one of the biggest counterculture icons ever, had a father who was not only a prominent member of the U.S. Navy, but who was directly involved in the incident widely regarded as the catalyst for for increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Jim, of course, is not the only prominent figure from the 60s hippie scene that people believe may have been a government plant. Going back to Charles Manson, there are a lot of people who think he was a CIA asset of some sort. While this has never been confirmed, there is quite a bit of information which does suggest Manson may have had government ties. As mentioned, after the horrific Manson murders in August of '69, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the murders. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, Charles Manson dispatched his witchy young legion into the town, where they butchered movie star Sharon Tate in her Beverly Hills home, which belonged to record producer Terry Melcher. Another victim that was murdered that night on August 9, 1969, was Jim Morrison's former hairstylist, Jay Sebring, along with 4 other victims. Heavy-duty paranoia descended upon the land. About a month later, for reasons that remain unclear, Jim Morrison was questioned by police detectives investigating the Tate-LaBianca murders. There was a rumor going around town that Jim had talked about the murders before they happened. Jim may have also been tied to the case through Sebring, or through connections in Topanga, where the Manson family had lived, or through acquaintances with one or more of Charlie's girls. Over the years, several of these still imprisoned women have claimed that they knew Jim Morrison, but similar claims about other contemporary celebrities are considered highly suspect and remain unproven.